Imagine stepping into the shoes of a medieval doctor, where sickness was not explained by germs or science, but by the alignment of the stars, the balance of bodily fluids, or even the displeasure of God. The world of medieval medicine was one of superstition, strange remedies, and dangerous practices that would shock us today. If you think a trip to the doctor now is unpleasant, you might be relieved to know that you would not have lasted even a single day as a physician in the Middle Ages. Patients were bled, purged, and treated with concoctions that ranged from herbs to ground-up animal parts. And doctors themselves were constantly surrounded by disease, risk, and sometimes ridicule. Before we dive into this strange and fascinating journey through history, I want to invite you to join our community here on History for Sleep. This channel is designed for those who want to relax, unwind, and gently drift off while learning something new. If you enjoy stories of the past, told in a calm, detailed way, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey through history. And while you listen, let us know in the comments what topics you'd love to hear about, and also when you find yourself listening, whether it's late at night, during an afternoon rest, or just when you need a quiet escape. Your input not only helps shape what we explore next, but it also connects you to others who share the same passion for history and relaxation. As we begin, settle into a comfortable place. Let your eyes grow heavy if you wish, and imagine the flickering candlelight of a medieval apothecary, the cold halls of a plague hospital, or the steady hands of a surgeon with nothing but a sharp blade and no anesthesia. Together, we'll journey back in time to uncover why medieval doctors worked the way they did, the strange jobs they performed, and the many ways their patients often suffered more than they healed. It is a story filled with mystery, danger, and odd remedies, but told here slowly and gently, so you can drift off peacefully while you learn. To step into the world of medieval medicine is to step into a place where the line between science, religion, and superstition was blurred beyond recognition. The people of medieval Europe lived in a time of uncertainty, where disease struck without warning and often without remedy, where the simplest illness could spiral into something deadly, and where the men and women who claimed the title of doctor worked with tools and ideas that now seem closer to magic than medicine. To understand why you would not last a single day as a medieval doctor, we must first understand what medicine itself looked like in this era. It was not just a profession, but a patchwork of beliefs, traditions, and experimental practices handed down from ancient scholars, blended with folklore, and heavily influenced by the powerful grip of the church. At the heart of this world was the reality of disease. Medieval towns and villages were cramped, dirty, and often overwhelmed by waste. Human refuse filled the streets, water sources were easily contaminated, and animals lived close to people, spreading parasites and infections. The concept of sanitation as we know it today was almost non-existent. As a result, sickness was common and relentless. Outbreaks of fevers, dysentery, leprosy, and plague swept through communities. Infant mortality was high, life expectancy was low, and death was a familiar visitor to every home. For the medieval doctor, the challenge was immense. How to diagnose and treat illnesses without any knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or the real causes of disease. Instead, medieval medicine was built on theories passed down from ancient authorities. Most importantly, the writings of Hippocrates and Galen. These Greek and Roman physicians had offered explanations for how the human body worked, explanations that were preserved and copied throughout the Middle Ages. To medieval minds, these ancient texts carried a weight of authority that could not be questioned. Doctors saw themselves as interpreters of these ideas, applying them to their patients with a mixture of logic, ritual, and hope. If the ancient masters said disease was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors, then the doctor's task was to restore that balance. If Galen taught that bloodletting was a way to cleanse the system, then bleeding a patient became a common practice. This reliance on ancient texts created a world where questioning or experimentation was rare, and where deviation from accepted wisdom could be seen as dangerous or even heretical. But medical practice was not uniform. In fact, the term doctor itself could mean many different things in medieval Europe. There were university-trained physicians who studied at centers of learning in places like Salerno, Montpellier, or Bologna. These men-women were generally excluded from universities, considered themselves learned scholars, focusing more on theory and diagnosis than on hands-on treatment. Then there were barber-surgeons, who dealt with the messy, physical side of medicine, cutting, bleeding, pulling teeth, setting bones, and amputating limbs. Apothecaries mixed herbs, minerals, and other ingredients into potions and remedies, while midwives assisted with childbirth, often relying on generations of practical knowledge. Monks also played a key role, tending to the sick within monasteries and maintaining herb gardens that provided some of the more effective treatments available. For the average person, seeking medical care could mean turning to any of these figures or, in many cases, to a local wise woman, healer, or even a traveling charlatan. Religion was never far from medicine in the medieval mind. Illness was often interpreted as a punishment from God for sins, or as a test of faith. Treatments frequently included prayer, confession, pilgrimages to holy sites, or the application of relics and holy water. A medieval doctor, therefore, might recommend not only a purge or a herbal remedy, but also a series of prayers or a visit to a shrine. This blending of physical and spiritual healing reflected the worldview of the time, where body and soul were inseparably linked. To treat one without the other seemed impossible. Another defining feature of medieval medicine was its reliance on astrology. Doctors often consulted the stars and planets before diagnosing an illness or deciding on a treatment. The position of the moon might determine the best time to perform bloodletting, while the alignment of the constellations could reveal the cause of a patient's suffering. Charts and diagrams of the zodiac man a figure, showing how each body part was linked to a sign of the zodiac were common tools in a physician's kit. Though this may sound strange today, it reflected a deeply held belief that the heavens influenced life on earth in every aspect, including health. For the medieval doctor, daily life was filled with challenges that went beyond theory and treatment. The lack of effective cures meant that many patients did not survive. In fact, death was often more common than recovery. This could make the doctor's role one of despair, as their best efforts rarely produced results we would call successful. At the same time, doctors faced danger themselves, especially during times of epidemic. To treat patients with plague or leprosy was to risk exposure and death. Some physicians refused to see certain patients out of fear, while others became martyrs to their profession, succumbing to the very diseases they tried to heal. It is also worth noting that the medieval doctor's reputation was often mixed. While the wealthy might seek out trained physicians, the poor often viewed them with suspicion. The complex language of humors, astrology, and ancient texts could seem distant from everyday experience. Many people trusted local healers or family remedies over the advice of a stranger with scholarly training. This tension meant that doctors had to navigate not only the mysteries of disease, but also the trust or mistrust of their communities. In this strange world, even the tools of medicine were vastly different from what we imagine today. A doctor's kit might include scalpels and lancets for bloodletting, cups for cupping therapy, and jars of leeches. An apothecary's shelves might hold dried herbs, powders, and preserved animal parts, ready to be mixed into tonics. A surgeon's equipment would be crude and unsterilized, with little regard for cleanliness. Pain relief was minimal, sometimes limited to alcohol, opium in rare cases, or simple distraction. To be a doctor in this environment was to work constantly on the edge of the unknown, with few reliable methods to fight disease. Yet, despite all these challenges, medieval medicine was not entirely without merit. Some herbal remedies were genuinely effective, such as willow bark for pain relief, which contains the same active ingredient later synthesized into aspirin. Monks carefully recorded their observations, preserving knowledge that would one day contribute to modern science. The influence of Islamic medicine, through translations of works by scholars like Avicenna, introduced new ideas and practices to Europe. These glimmers of progress remind us that even in a world dominated by superstition, there were seeds of knowledge that would eventually grow into the medical science we rely on today. Still, for someone living now, trying to step into this world would be nearly impossible. The constant exposure to disease, the lack of effective treatment, and the reliance on ideas that we now know to be false would make it overwhelming, frightening, and deeply dangerous. To be a medieval doctor was to live in a world of uncertainty, where every patient was a mystery and every cure a gamble. It was a life of courage and risk, often with little reward. And that is why, if you were suddenly transported back in time, you would not last even a single day in the world of medieval medicine. This first chapter lays the foundation for everything to come. As we continue, we will look deeper into the theories that guided these doctors, starting with the famous and deeply flawed system of the four humors. It is there, in the attempt to balance blood, phlegm, and bile, that we will see just how strange and sometimes dangerous medieval medicine could truly be. At the heart of medieval medicine lay an ancient idea that had shaped healing for centuries: the theory of the four humors. To modern eyes, it seems almost unbelievable that a system so deeply flawed could have guided medical practice for nearly 2,000 years. Yet for doctors of the Middle Ages, the humors were the foundation of diagnosis, treatment, and understanding of the body itself. To be a physician in this period was to see every cough, fever, and injury through the lens of these mysterious fluids. Without them, medicine as they knew it would not have existed. And for anyone today who imagines trying to survive a day as a medieval doctor, the four humors would be the first and most bewildering obstacle. The theory traced its origins back to the ancient Greeks, especially the physician Hippocrates in the 5th century BCE. Hippocrates and his followers believed that the human body was governed by four vital fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These fluids, or humors, from the Latin word for moisture, were thought to circulate through the body and determine a person's health, temperament, and even personality. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. If the humors were in balance, a person was healthy. If one humor became excessive or deficient, disease would result. This explanation offered doctors a framework that seemed logical, flexible, and applicable to every case. Galen, a Greek physician working in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century CE, expanded on Hippocrates' ideas and cemented their authority. He wrote extensively about how the humors related to anatomy, physiology, and treatment. Galen's writings became so influential that they were copied, preserved, and revered throughout the medieval period. His authority was considered almost absolute, and questioning his conclusions was rare. For centuries, Galen's interpretation of the humors dominated medical schools, universities, and everyday practice. By the Middle Ages, the theory of the four humors was woven so tightly into medicine that few could imagine healing without it. Each humor was linked not only to health, but to qualities of personality and behavior. Blood, considered warm and moist, was associated with a sanguine temperament, optimistic, social, and cheerful. Phlegm, cold and moist, created a phlegmatic personality, calm, sluggish, and unemotional. Yellow bile, hot and dry, produced a choleric temperament, angry, ambitious, and irritable. Black bile, cold and dry, was tied to the melancholic type, thoughtful, gloomy, and prone to sadness. Thus, a doctor could interpret both physical symptoms and personal characteristics as signs of humoral imbalance. A patient who was too quick-tempered might be thought to suffer from an excess of yellow bile, while someone frequently sad was believed to carry too much black bile. This blending of body and mind gave the theory a universal scope that seemed to explain almost everything. When a medieval patient fell ill, the doctor's first task was to determine which humor was out of balance. Diagnosis often began with close observation of outward signs. The complexion of the skin, the color of the tongue, the quality of the voice, and the overall demeanor of the patient could all provide clues. But perhaps the most telling evidence came from bodily fluids. Physicians regularly examined blood, saliva, sweat, and especially urine. Urine was considered a mirror of the body's inner state, and doctors studied its color, odor, and sometimes even its taste. A pale, watery urine might signal too much phlegm, while dark, thick urine could mean an excess of black bile. Charts of urine colors were widely used, allowing physicians to match a sample with a diagnosis. Though to us this seems unscientific, for medieval doctors it was a precise and respected method. Once the humor at fault had been identified, treatment focused on restoring balance. The guiding principle was often contraria contrarias, opposites are cured by opposites. If the body was too hot, a cooling treatment was applied. If too dry, moisture was prescribed. For an excess of blood, the obvious remedy was bloodletting, either through cutting a vein or applying leeches. Too much phlegm might be treated with warming foods or inducing vomiting. Yellow bile could be countered with cooling herbs and diets, while black bile might be treated with purgatives to cleanse the system. These treatments were often harsh, and patients might be weakened further by the cure than by the illness itself. Yet within the logic of humors, they made perfect sense. Diet played a crucial role in humoral medicine. Every food was classified according to its qualities of hot, cold, moist, or dry. Bread, meat, wine, fruits, and vegetables were all believed to influence the humors in specific ways. A choleric patient might be advised to avoid spicy or hot foods, while a melancholic person was urged to eat lighter, more moist dishes. Even the time of year and the weather were thought to affect the balance of humors. Cold winters encouraged an increase of phlegm, while hot summers stirred up yellow bile. Thus, medicine was not just about remedies, but about lifestyle, diet, and environment, all interpreted through the language of humors. For the medieval doctor, mastery of the four humors required extensive study. University students pored over Galen's texts and memorized the qualities of each humor. Lectures emphasized theory rather than practice, and examinations tested knowledge of classical authorities rather than hands-on skill. This theoretical approach often left physicians more comfortable with diagnosis than with treatment, leaving the messy work of surgery or physical care to barber-surgeons and other practitioners. Yet within the intellectual circles of the time, a deep knowledge of humors was seen as the mark of a learned doctor. Of course, not everyone in medieval society fully embraced humoral theory. Many ordinary people relied on folk remedies and local healers who worked outside the framework of Galen. Still, even these practices were often shaped indirectly by humoral ideas. The notion that illness came from imbalance was so widespread that it influenced popular understanding as well as professional medicine. Patients themselves might describe their ailments in terms of hot and cold, wet and dry, echoing the categories of the humors. Thus, even when doctors were absent, the humors shaped how people thought about their bodies. The persistence of the four humors, despite their lack of scientific basis, tells us something important about the medieval world. Medicine was not judged by whether it cured in a modern sense, but by whether it fit into a framework that seemed logical and consistent with established authorities. When a patient recovered, the cure was credited. When they died, it could be explained as the will of God or the severity of the imbalance. Without the ability to measure germs, cells, or chemistry, medieval doctors worked with what they had: observation, tradition, and the wisdom of the past. In this context, the four humors offered a structure that felt reliable, even if it was deeply flawed. For someone today, Stepping into this system would be bewildering. Imagine sitting with a patient, trying to decide whether their fever came from too much blood or an excess of yellow bile. Imagine examining a vial of urine by candlelight, sniffing it for clues, and comparing its color to a chart. Imagine prescribing a diet of moist fruits or recommending bloodletting, all without the slightest understanding of microbes or the real causes of disease. The responsibility would be overwhelming, the uncertainty crushing. Yet for the medieval doctor, this was the daily reality, the very essence of their craft. The influence of the four humors extended far beyond medicine. It shaped literature, philosophy, and culture itself. Poets described characters in terms of humoral temperaments. Artists painted figures with colors and moods that reflected sanguine, choleric, melancholic, or phlegmatic qualities. Even political leaders were sometimes judged according to their humors, with their behavior explained as the product of bodily fluids. This cultural entanglement made the theory even harder to dislodge, for it was not only a medical idea, but a worldview. Only with the rise of modern science, centuries later, did the four humors finally lose their grip. The discoveries of circulation, anatomy, and eventually germs rendered the theory obsolete. But for the medieval world, it remained the guiding star of medicine, the language through which doctors understood health and disease. To reject it would have been to reject the entire intellectual tradition of the age. In reflecting on this strange system, we see both the limitations and the resilience of human thought. The four humors were wrong, but they were an attempt to impose order on the chaos of illness. They provided a way to act, however misguided, in the face of suffering. And for medieval doctors, that framework gave meaning to their work and a sense of control in a world where disease often seemed uncontrollable. For us today, the lesson is humbling. Without the tools of modern science, we too might have clung to such theories, believing them to be the key to health. As we leave behind the world of humors, our journey continues into the practical side of medieval medicine. The next chapter will explore the Barber-Surgeons, those strange figures who cut hair, drew blood, and performed surgeries with equal confidence. If the humors shaped the theory of medicine, the Barber-Surgeons embodied its practice messy, dangerous, and unforgettable. If the university-trained physician was the thinker of the medieval medical world, then the barber-surgeon was its doer. This peculiar figure, part healer, part tradesman, and part performer, filled a vital role in towns and villages across Europe. The barber-surgeon was responsible not only for cutting hair and shaving beards, but also for performing many of the most common and most dangerous medical procedures of the age. Bloodletting, tooth-pulling, setting bones, lancing boils, and amputating limbs all fell under their domain. In many ways, they were the doctor's most ordinary people encountered, for their work was practical, direct, and often affordable. Yet their methods were crude, their tools unsanitary, and their understanding shaped by the same flawed theories that guided physicians. To witness or undergo their treatments is to truly understand why surviving a single day as a medieval doctor or patient was such a daunting challenge. The barber-surgeon's dual role as both barber and healer might seem strange to us, but in the medieval world, it made perfect sense. Barbers already possessed sharp blades, steady hands, and a tolerance for blood. They were accustomed to working with razors and knives, trimming hair, and shaving faces, all of which required a degree of manual skill and dexterity. These same qualities made them suitable for simple surgeries. When the demand arose for bloodletting or minor operations, barbers naturally stepped in to fill the gap. Over time, their role expanded until they became recognized as barber-surgeons, distinct from but intertwined with other medical practitioners. One of the most common tasks of the barber-surgeon was bloodletting. This practice, rooted in the theory of the four humors, was believed to cleanse the body of excess blood and restore balance. Patients suffering from fevers, headaches, or even emotional disturbances were often prescribed bloodletting. The barber surgeon would open a vein with a lancet or razor, allowing blood to flow into a bowl. The amount taken varied depending on the diagnosis, the patient's strength, and the phase of the moon or alignment of the stars, for astrology often guided the timing of such procedures. In some cases, leeches were applied instead of cutting. These small creatures would attach themselves to the skin and draw blood slowly, believed to offer a gentler form of the same remedy. To the medieval mind, this was not gruesome, but necessary, a cleansing of the system akin to pruning a plant or draining a swamp. The barber shop itself reflected this dual role. Outside, a striped pole with red and white bands signaled the trade. The red represented blood, the white symbolized bandages, and the pole itself echoed the stick patients gripped to encourage veins to swell during bloodletting. Inside, the chair where one man might have his beard trimmed could also serve as the place where another had his vein opened. Tools of both grooming and surgery sat side by side: razors, scissors, combs, alongside scalpels, cupping glasses, and bowls for collecting blood. It was a place of transformation, whether cosmetic or medical, and a space where the boundaries between daily life and life-threatening treatment blurred. Beyond bloodletting, barber surgeons performed a wide range of procedures. Toothaches were a common complaint, and extractions were a regular part of their work. With no anesthesia and little understanding of infection, the barber surgeon would use iron tools to grip and pull the offending tooth, often causing more trauma than relief. Broken bones were also their responsibility. Using splints, bandages, and sometimes crude traction methods, they attempted to set fractures. While some patients recovered with reasonable success, others faced permanent deformity or lingering pain. Infections were frequent, and without antiseptics, even a minor wound could become life-threatening. Perhaps the most dramatic part of the barber surgeon's repertoire was surgery itself. Operations were performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or proper sterilization. Amputations, for example, were sometimes necessary after battlefield injuries or gangrenous infections. The barber surgeon would tie off the limb, saw through flesh and bone with speed, and cauterize the wound with a hot iron to stop bleeding. Patients often screamed in agony, fainted from shock, or died from blood loss or infection. Yet in some cases, the brutal procedure saved lives, as leaving a rotting limb untreated would inevitably lead to death. To the barber surgeon, success was measured not by comfort but by survival. Cupping was another widely practiced treatment. Heated cups were placed on the skin, creating suction that was thought to draw out bad humors or toxins. The marks left behind, circular and red, were considered evidence of the therapy's effectiveness. Lancing boils, draining abscesses, and treating wounds were also routine. The barber surgeon dealt with the body directly, in all its messy realities, and his work brought him closer to blood, pus, and pain than most physicians ever came. In a sense, he was both respected and feared, a necessary figure whose tools could bring relief or suffering in equal measure. The training of barber surgeons varied. Some apprenticed with established practitioners, learning by watching and doing rather than through books. Guilds and professional organizations eventually formed, attempting to regulate the trade and distinguish skilled barber surgeons from mere quacks. In cities, these guilds held power, setting standards for practice and sometimes clashing with physicians over authority. In rural areas, however, barber surgeons often operated independently, their reputation built on word of mouth and the outcomes of their treatments. Their success, though limited, ensured their survival in communities where no university-trained doctor was available. For patients, the experience of visiting a barber surgeon was often terrifying. Imagine sitting in a wooden chair, gripping the arms tightly as a man in a stained apron approaches with a gleaming razor. The air smells of iron, sweat, and smoke from the cauterizing iron heating in the fire. There are no painkillers, no clean bandages, no sterile instruments. The cut is made quickly, blood flowing freely into a bowl as the barber works with practiced efficiency. The patient may faint or cry out, while onlookers wait their turn for the same procedure. To us, it seems barbaric, but to them, it was the hope of relief, the promise of balance restored. Despite the crude methods, barber-surgeons filled a vital niche. They were accessible to ordinary people who could not afford physicians, and they provided immediate, tangible interventions. While physicians might debate the qualities of humors in Latin, the barber-surgeon acted, cutting, pulling, and bleeding as needed. This practical approach earned them a place in society, though it also exposed them to criticism. Physicians sometimes looked down on them as mere tradesmen, lacking the intellectual refinement of true medicine. Yet without them, countless patients would have had no care at all. The risks of their work were immense. Without understanding infection, barber-surgeons reused tools without cleaning them, spreading disease from one patient to another. Blood loss, shock, and gangrene claimed many lives. The very act of seeking treatment could hasten death rather than prevent it. Yet for all these dangers, people continued to visit barber-surgeons because they had no better alternatives. In an age before antibiotics, vaccines, or modern surgery, even flawed treatments offered a glimmer of hope. The image of the barber-surgeon has endured in history, partly because it embodies the contradictions of medieval medicine. He was both barber and doctor, healer and butcher, essential and dangerous. His striped pole still stands outside barbershops today, a remnant of a time when haircuts and surgeries were offered in the same place. To step into his world is to confront the raw reality of medieval healthcare, where the tools of healing were sharp blades, hot irons, and a willingness to endure pain. For a modern person, surviving even a single encounter with a barber-surgeon would be almost unimaginable. The lack of anesthesia, the ever-present risk of infection, and the brutal nature of the procedures would test the strongest will. To be the barber-surgeon himself would be no less daunting. The constant exposure to blood and suffering, the cries of patients, and the thin line between life and death would weigh heavily on anyone. It was a profession of courage and cruelty, necessity and danger, one that defined the very essence of medieval medicine. As we leave the world of the barber-surgeon, our journey takes us to another strange and fascinating aspect of medieval healing: the role of the stars. In the next chapter, we will explore how astrology guided the decisions of doctors, shaping when surgeries were performed, how diagnoses were made, and why the heavens were believed to hold the secrets of health and disease. For the medieval doctor, the stars were more than twinkling lights in the night sky. They were guides, teachers, and sometimes masters of fate. To understand illness and health, many physicians believed it was essential to understand the movements of the heavens. Astrology was not a fringe superstition, but an integral part of medieval medicine, woven into its very fabric. The position of the moon, the alignment of planets, and the influence of the zodiac were thought to affect the human body in profound ways. Without astrology, a physician of the Middle Ages might feel as lost as a sailor without a compass. To step into their world is to realize how deeply the celestial was tied to the terrestrial, and how diagnosis and treatment could hinge on the stars. The roots of astrological medicine stretched back to the ancient world. Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans all observed the sky, believing the heavens influenced life on earth. This heritage passed into medieval Europe through translations of Greek and Arabic texts, which preserved and elaborated on astrological theories. By the 12th century, astrology was firmly entrenched in European universities, studied alongside medicine and philosophy. Doctors who trained at institutions such as Salerno or Montpellier were expected to learn not only about the four humors, but also about the stars that supposedly guided them. Far from being seen as separate disciplines, medicine and astrology were considered complementary, two sides of the same coin. One of the most striking ways astrology entered medicine was through the concept of the zodiac man. This was a diagram of a human figure overlaid with the 12 signs of the zodiac, each ruling a different part of the body. Aries governed the head, Taurus the neck and throat, Gemini the arms and lungs, Cancer the chest, Leo the heart, Virgo the stomach, Libra the kidneys, Scorpio the reproductive organs, Sagittarius the thighs, Capricorn the knees, Aquarius the calves, and Pisces the feet. By consulting this chart, doctors believed they could understand which parts of the body were most affected at a given time. A headache might be explained by the position of Aries, while stomach troubles could be linked to Virgo. The Zodiac Man appeared in countless medical manuscripts, serving as both a teaching tool and a practical reference for practitioners. Astrology influenced not only diagnosis, but also the timing of treatments. Bloodletting, for example, was considered more or less effective depending on the position of the moon. Performing the procedure under the wrong sign could be dangerous, while the right sign promised success. Surgeons and barber-surgeons often consulted astrological charts before cutting, believing that the heavens dictated the flow of blood and the strength of healing. Even the choice of herbs for a remedy might be guided by astrology, as plants themselves were thought to be under the influence of particular planets or signs. The universe was seen as a vast, interconnected system, with stars, plants, and human bodies all linked in a cosmic chain. For patients, this reliance on astrology could be both comforting and bewildering. On the one hand, it offered an explanation for why illness struck when it did. If the stars were misaligned, then the timing was fated, not random. On the other hand, it placed healing outside the realm of human control. A doctor could only act in harmony with the heavens, never against them. This belief gave astrology an aura of inevitability, making patients more accepting of both success and failure in treatment. If a cure worked, it was thanks to favorable stars. If it failed, the stars were to blame. The tools of astrological medicine included complex charts and tables. Physicians consulted almanacs that listed planetary positions and lunar phases. They drew horoscopes for patients, marking the exact time of birth to determine their astrological constitution. This natal chart, like the humors, was thought to shape both personality and health. A choleric individual might be linked to fiery signs, while a melancholic one could be tied to Saturn. Such correspondences gave doctors a framework to interpret both chronic conditions and acute illnesses. The act of casting a horoscope was not unusual but expected, part of the physician's skill set alongside examining urine or prescribing diets. Astrology's prestige was bolstered by the Church's complex relationship with it. While some church leaders condemned astrology as a form of divination, others accepted it as a tool for understanding God's creation. After all, if the heavens were made by God, then their influence could be part of His plan. Many clerics studied astrology themselves, and some monasteries preserved astrological texts. This uneasy acceptance allowed astrology to flourish, though always with the caution that it should not override faith. Doctors could consult the stars, but ultimate healing was still seen as coming from God. For the medieval doctor, the challenge was balancing the theoretical with the practical. Astrological charts could be complex and time-consuming to interpret. Patients suffering from pain or fever might not appreciate waiting while a physician consulted the heavens. Yet the belief that timing mattered was strong. A skilled doctor was expected to know not only which humor was imbalanced, but also when the stars favored a particular treatment. In this way, astrology added both depth and difficulty to the physician's role. To ignore it would be seen as negligence, but to rely on it too heavily risked delaying needed action. Consider what it would be like for a modern person to try practicing medicine in this way. Imagine a patient arriving with a severe infection, feverish and weak. Instead of administering antibiotics, you consult a chart of planetary positions, calculate the moon's phase, and study the zodiac man to determine which body part is under celestial influence. The decision to lance a boil or bleed a vein depends not only on symptoms, but on whether Mars is in opposition, or the moon in Scorpio. To us, this seems absurd. Yet to the medieval doctor, it was a rational and necessary step. The weight of tradition, education, and culture demanded it. Astrology also shaped public expectations. Patients sometimes sought out doctors specifically known for their astrological skill. Wealthy patrons might commission elaborate horoscopes, not only for health, but for guidance in all aspects of life. Kings and nobles consulted physicians who doubled as astrologers, valuing their advice on when to travel, when to fight battles, and when to marry. In such cases, the line between doctor and counselor blurred. The physician became not just a healer, but a guide to destiny itself. For those of high rank, this blending of medicine and astrology reinforced their sense that their lives were intimately connected to the movements of the heavens. Despite its prominence, astrology did face critics. Some argued it distracted from practical remedies, leading doctors to delay or avoid necessary interventions. Others saw it as dangerously close to paganism or sorcery. Yet its hold on medicine remained strong well into the Renaissance. Even as new discoveries in anatomy and physiology began to challenge old ideas, astrology persisted. The famous physician Paracelsus in the 16th century still emphasized celestial influence, blending it with alchemy and herbalism. The eventual decline of astrological medicine came only with the rise of modern science, when astronomy separated from astrology and empirical methods began to replace speculation. Still, for centuries, astrology offered medieval doctors a sense of order in a chaotic world. Disease was unpredictable, remedies unreliable, and death ever present. The stars provided a map, a way to make sense of suffering and impose structure on uncertainty. For doctors, it was a source of authority. For patients, a source of meaning. Even if the heavens did not truly guide their health, the belief that they did gave both doctor and patient a shared language of hope and explanation. To imagine practicing medicine this way is to understand how different the medieval worldview was from ours. For us, the body is governed by biology and chemistry. For them, it was part of a cosmic system where planets, humors, and souls all interacted. To step into that mindset even briefly is to see why modern medicine would be unimaginable to them, just as their methods are unimaginable to us. It is also to see why a modern person would not last long in their shoes. The uncertainty, the reliance on the stars, the weight of decisions made by celestial charts, these would overwhelm anyone accustomed to the clarity of modern science. As our journey continues, we will leave the heavens behind and return to Earth, exploring the strange remedies concocted by apothecaries. From herbs and minerals to powdered animal parts and exotic imports, the medieval pharmacy was a cabinet of curiosities. In the next chapter, we will step into the apothecary's shop and discover the strange mixtures that promised healing, but often delivered little more than mystery. If the barber-surgeon was the one who cut and stitched, and the physician the one who diagnosed and theorized, then the apothecary was the one who provided the potions, powders, and concoctions meant to heal. In many ways, the apothecary was the medieval world's pharmacist, though their role extended far beyond what we would consider scientific medicine today. Their shops were filled with the scents of herbs, the glint of glass jars, and the strange sight of dried animal parts, minerals, and powders stacked side by side. For medieval patients, stepping into an apothecary's shop was like entering a place of both mystery and hope. For us today, it would be more like entering a museum of curiosities or a witch's workshop. The remedies they offered could be soothing, harmful, or simply strange, but in a time when few treatments truly worked, the apothecary's wares carried an undeniable appeal. Apothecaries often trained through apprenticeships, learning their craft from older practitioners who passed down recipes and techniques. Unlike physicians who studied at universities and dealt mostly in theory, apothecaries were practical workers. They gathered herbs from fields, cultivated medicinal plants in gardens, and purchased exotic ingredients from merchants who traveled along trade routes from the East. Their knowledge was hands-on, born of experimentation and tradition. In bustling towns, an apothecary's shop might serve not only the poor, but also wealthy patrons, including physicians who relied on them to prepare remedies for their patients. In rural areas, the apothecary might double as a general healer, offering advice and cures directly. Herbal remedies were the backbone of the apothecary's trade. Plants such as sage, rosemary, chamomile, and mint were widely used, each believed to have specific properties that affected the humors. For example, mint was thought to aid digestion, chamomile to calm the nerves, and rosemary to strengthen memory. Some of these remedies had real effects, offering mild relief or comfort, though the reasoning behind them was still framed in terms of hot, cold, moist, and dry. An apothecary might prescribe warming herbs for a cold illness or cooling herbs for a fever, always seeking to restore balance. The gardens of monasteries and noble estates often supplied apothecaries with a steady source of plants, making them central to the practice of medicine. Yet the apothecary's shelves held far stranger ingredients as well. Animal parts were commonly used, sometimes dried and ground into powders. Crushed beetles, powdered lizard, and dried hearts or brains of animals might be incorporated into remedies. Some believed that the properties of an animal could transfer to the patient's strength from a lion, speed from a deer, fertility from a rabbit. At times, even human materials were used. Powdered mummy, imported from Egypt, became a popular though macabre treatment in later centuries, believed to cure everything from headaches to internal bleeding. Blood, urine, and even hair could find their way into concoctions, blurring the line between medicine and superstition. Minerals and stones also played a role. Ground pearls, precious gems, or powdered metals were added to certain remedies, often reserved for the wealthy who could afford such extravagance. Mercury, lead, and arsenic were occasionally prescribed, substances we now know to be toxic. The shimmering appearance of these ingredients, however, lent them an aura of potency, and patients often believed that the more exotic or costly the treatment, the more effective it must be. To swallow a potion laced with crushed gemstones was seen not as dangerous, but as a mark of privilege and sophistication. Recipes could be elaborate, mixing dozens of ingredients into a single preparation. Theriac, for instance, was a famous compound remedy that claimed to be an antidote to all poisons and a cure for numerous diseases. Originating in the ancient world, it included herbs, spices, animal parts, and sometimes opium, blended into a paste that was aged for years. Apothecaries guarded such recipes carefully, and the making of theriac could be a grand public event with great ceremony attached to its preparation. Patients treasured it, and its fame endured for centuries, despite its dubious effectiveness. The apothecary's shop itself was a sensory experience. Jars and bottles lined wooden shelves, labeled in Latin or the local tongue. Mortar and pestles stood ready for grinding, scales for weighing, and cauldrons for boiling. The air was heavy with the mixed aromas of herbs, spices, and oils. Customers might arrive with a physician's prescription, which the apothecary would carefully prepare, or they might seek advice directly, describing their symptoms and receiving a custom remedy. In either case, the apothecary occupied a respected place in the community, straddling the line between learned medicine and everyday healing. Some remedies offered real benefits, even if the reasoning was flawed. Willow bark, containing salicin, acted as a natural pain reliever. Garlic, used for infections, had antibacterial properties. Honey, often applied to wounds, has natural antiseptic qualities. These treatments worked not because of humoral theory, but because of the chemical properties of the ingredients themselves. In this sense, apothecaries preserved fragments of useful knowledge that would later be rediscovered by modern science. At the same time, many remedies were useless or harmful, offering little more than a placebo effect or causing new illnesses. The patient who swallowed mercury or lead in hopes of a cure often suffered more from the treatment than the disease. The role of the apothecary also carried social and cultural weight. They were businessmen as well as healers, selling not only medicines, but also spices, perfumes, and other goods. In towns, their shops were gathering places where people exchanged news and gossip. Their work linked them to global trade, for many of their ingredients came from distant lands. Cinnamon, cloves, and pepper arrived from Asia, prized not only as flavorings, but as medicinal agents. The apothecary thus stood at the crossroads of local tradition and international commerce, embodying the mixture of the familiar and the exotic that defined medieval medicine. For a modern person, entering an apothecary's shop would be a bewildering experience. Imagine being handed a potion made from crushed beetles and powdered gemstones, told it would cure your fever. Imagine being offered a salve containing mercury, applied to your skin to draw out illness. Imagine sipping theriac, thick and bitter, believing it would protect you from plague or poison. The very thought would make most of us recoil. Yet for medieval patients, these remedies were sources of comfort, signs that something was being done in the face of suffering. The strange and the ordinary mixed together, giving the apothecary's work an aura of both science and magic. To survive as a medieval apothecary or as one of their patients required a willingness to trust in this strange mixture of knowledge and superstition. The doctor who prescribed, the barber-surgeon who cut, and the apothecary who mixed all worked within the same system, each playing a role in the great effort to keep illness at bay. For us today, their remedies often seem more dangerous than the diseases they treated. Yet without them, the medieval world would have been even more helpless against the constant threat of sickness. As we move forward in our journey, we turn from the bustling shops of apothecaries to the quiet halls of monasteries, where monks tended the sick with prayer, herbs, and devotion. In the next chapter, we will explore how monasteries became centers of healing, preserving knowledge and offering care in a world where so much depended on faith and tradition. In the often chaotic and disease-ridden landscape of medieval Europe, monasteries stood as islands of relative calm, order, and care. Long before cities developed organized hospitals or secular institutions of medicine, monasteries served as centers of healing for both body and soul. Within their stone walls, monks cultivated gardens filled with medicinal herbs, copied ancient medical texts by hand, and tended to the sick with a combination of prayer, observation, and rudimentary treatment. For many people, especially the poor who could not afford a physician or apothecary, the monastery was the closest thing to a hospital they would ever know. To understand the world of medieval medicine, one must walk through the cloisters and infirmaries of these religious houses, where care was as much about faith as it was about herbs. The role of monasteries in healing was rooted in Christian duty. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, instructed monks to care for the sick as though they were Christ himself. This principle gave rise to a culture in which charity and healing were inseparable. Monastic communities believed that tending to the sick was an act of devotion, a way to serve God through service to others. As a result, nearly every monastery had an infirmary, staffed by monks who specialized in caring for the ill. These monks were not physicians in the university sense, but their dedication and daily practice made them effective caregivers within the limits of their time. One of the most important contributions of monasteries was the cultivation of medicinal herbs. Monks carefully planted and maintained gardens filled with plants believed to have healing properties. Sage, fennel, lavender, comfrey, and many others grew in neat rows, each with a known use. Lavender might be brewed into a tea for headaches, fennel used to soothe stomach pains, and comfrey applied to wounds to encourage healing. The monastery garden was both a pharmacy and a classroom, where knowledge was passed from one generation of monks to the next. Manuscripts such as Herbal's illustrated guides to plants and their uses were copied and preserved in scriptoria, ensuring that this knowledge survived through centuries of upheaval. The monastery infirmary was often a quiet, dimly lit space where the sick were given rest, simple food, and herbal remedies. Beds lined the walls, sometimes with curtains for privacy. Monks attended patients with a mixture of practical care and spiritual guidance. They offered prayers, read scripture, and provided the sacraments, believing that illness was not only a physical trial, but also a spiritual one. For many patients, the monastery offered comfort that went beyond medicine. To be surrounded by the chanting of monks, the smell of incense, and the rhythm of daily prayer created an atmosphere of peace, even if the body did not recover. Healing, in this sense, was as much about the soul as the flesh. The preservation of knowledge was another vital aspect of monastic medicine. While much of Europe struggled through political turmoil and invasions, monasteries served as repositories of learning. Ancient texts by Hippocrates, Galen, and Dioscorides were copied and studied, keeping alive the medical traditions of Greece and Rome. These writings, combined with practical observations from daily care, formed the foundation of medieval medical understanding. Without the patient work of monks, much of this classical knowledge might have been lost. Their scriptoria, filled with the scratching of quills on parchment, ensured that the wisdom of the past survived long enough to influence the future. Monasteries were also places of hospitality. Travelers, pilgrims, and the poor often found refuge within their walls, and with refuge came medical care. Many monasteries were located along pilgrimage routes, where weary and sick travelers sought both spiritual and physical aid. The monks provided food, shelter, and treatment, embodying the Christian ideal of charity. In this way, monasteries extended their healing mission beyond their own members to society at large. For the poor, who had few other options, the monastery was often the only accessible source of medical help. It would be misleading, however, to imagine monastic healing as purely scientific or consistently effective. Superstition and religion were deeply woven into their practice. Illness was often seen as a punishment for sin or a test from God, and cures could include prayers, blessings, or pilgrimages. Relics of saints were sometimes applied to the sick, believed to carry divine power. Holy water and the sign of the cross were as common in treatment as herbs and ointments. In this environment, the line between medicine and miracle blurred, and patients often sought both with equal hope. Despite these limitations, monasteries occasionally pioneered approaches that foreshadowed later medical advances. Cleanliness, for instance, was emphasized in monastic life. Regular washing, orderly spaces, and structured routines helped reduce disease, even if the monks did not understand germs. Diet was also carefully managed, with attention to simple, balanced foods. Patients in monastic care might receive better nourishment and rest than they would at home, improving their chances of recovery. In this sense, the monastery's environment itself was part of its healing power. For a modern person, the experience of being treated in a medieval monastery would be both strange and oddly comforting. Imagine lying in a narrow bed as monks in brown habits move silently around you, their chants echoing through stone halls. A brother brings you a cup of herbal tea, its flavor bitter but soothing. Another reads to you from Scripture, reminding you to place your trust in God. You feel the cool touch of lavender on your forehead, the warm glow of candlelight at your bedside. There are no antibiotics, no modern equipment, yet there is a sense of care, a rhythm of devotion that makes you feel less alone. In such moments, healing was more than the curing of illness. It was the restoration of peace to troubled souls. Monastic medicine also reflected the broader connections of medieval Europe. Through contact with the Islamic world, new medical texts and practices entered monastic libraries. Translations of Arabic scholars, such as Avicenna and Al-Razi, introduced new ideas, expanding the horizons of European medicine. Monks copied and studied these works, integrating them into their existing knowledge. In this way, Monasteries became conduits for the exchange of medical traditions across cultures, playing a role in the gradual evolution of medicine from superstition to science. The decline of monastic medicine came gradually as universities, hospitals, and secular physicians gained prominence. By the later Middle Ages, professional doctors and apothecaries increasingly took over the role of healing in towns and cities. Yet monasteries continued to care for their own members and for travelers, maintaining their traditions of charity. The dissolution of monasteries in some countries, such as England under Henry VIII, marked a significant loss of medical knowledge and care, as monastic libraries were scattered and infirmaries closed. Still, the influence of monastic medicine lived on in the preservation of texts and the herbal traditions that survived in folk medicine. For anyone imagining themselves as a medieval doctor, a monastery presents a different kind of challenge. Instead of wielding scalpels or consulting astrological charts, you would find yourself surrounded by the slow rhythm of prayer and the quiet labor of tending plants. Your treatments would be gentle herbs, rest, and blessings, but your understanding of disease would remain limited. You might see patients recover and give thanks to God, or you might see them die and believe it was His will. Either way, your role would be one of service, not mastery, shaped by humility rather than authority. For someone accustomed to the tools of modern medicine, it would be both peaceful and frustrating, a reminder of how deeply medicine was once tied to faith. As we move forward, we will leave the quiet cloisters of monasteries and step into one of the darkest chapters of medieval medicine, the era of the Black Death. In the next chapter, we will meet the plague doctors, with their long-beaked masks and desperate remedies, and explore how medicine struggled to face the deadliest pandemic in European history. Few images from medieval medicine are as haunting as that of the plague doctor, clad in a long robe, gloves, and the iconic beaked mask. Though the costume itself became more common in later centuries, it has come to symbolize the fear, desperation, and mystery that surrounded one of the most devastating events in European history, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, the bubonic plague swept across Europe, killing perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. It struck rich and poor alike, sparing neither kings nor peasants, monks nor merchants. Entire towns were emptied, families wiped out, and societies shaken to their core. For doctors of the time, the challenge was overwhelming. With little understanding of disease and no effective cures, they could do little more than witness the suffering and attempt remedies that often caused more harm than good. To imagine yourself as a doctor during this period is to place yourself at the center of unimaginable horror, where your life and those of your patients hung by the thinnest of threads. The Black Death arrived in Europe via trade routes from Asia, carried by fleas on rats that thrived in ships and warehouses. It spread with terrifying speed, moving from port cities into the countryside, following roads, rivers, and the paths of travelers. People woke each day to new reports of villages devastated and neighbors dead. The symptoms were swift and gruesome: fever, chills, vomiting, delirium, and the appearance of buboes, painful swellings in the lymph nodes, often in the groin or armpits. In many cases, victims died within days, their bodies covered with blackened sores that gave the disease its name. To live through this time was to live in constant fear of sudden death. Doctors faced an impossible task. Without knowledge of bacteria or contagion, they sought explanations in the only frameworks available: humors, astrology, and divine punishment. Some believed the plague was caused by an imbalance of the humors, worsened by corrupted air or miasma. Others looked to the heavens, noting unusual planetary alignments as the cause. Many saw it as a judgment from God, a punishment for the sins of humanity. Treatments reflected these beliefs. Bloodletting was common, with physicians hoping to draw out the poison. Patients were advised to purge their bodies through vomiting or laxatives. Herbal fumigations were burned to cleanse the air, while vinegar washes and ointments of strange mixtures were applied to buboes. None of these methods worked, and many weakened patients further, hastening their deaths. The plague doctor, as we imagine him today, wore a distinctive costume designed for protection. A long waxed robe covered the body, gloves and boots sealed the hands and feet, and a wide-brimmed hat marked the profession. Most striking of all was the mask, with glass openings for the eyes and a long curved beak stuffed with herbs, spices, or vinegar-soaked cloth. The idea was to filter out the bad air thought to carry the disease. While the mask may have offered some minimal barrier, it was far from effective against the real culprit, Yersinia pestis, a bacterium transmitted by fleas. Still, the sight of the plague doctor, moving through stricken streets like a bird of ill omen, became etched into the memory of the time. To patients, he was both a symbol of hope and a harbinger of death. In addition to attempting treatments, plague doctors often served as record keepers. They wrote reports on the spread of the disease, noted the symptoms of patients, and sometimes performed the grim task of counting the dead. In many cases, they were employed by towns or cities rather than by individual patients, paid a salary to care for the afflicted and document the epidemic. Their role was as much administrative as medical, reflecting the desperate need for some form of organized response. Yet their effectiveness remained minimal, and their survival was often a matter of luck. Fear of contagion shaped every aspect of daily life. Families abandoned their own members, neighbors refused to help one another, and priests hesitated to administer last rites. Those who could fled to the countryside, though flight often spread the disease further. Quarantines were imposed in some places, with ships held in harbor and travelers confined, but these measures were uneven and often too late. In the face of such devastation, many turned to extreme religious practices. Flagellants roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in penance to appease God's wrath. Others accused minority groups, such as Jews, of causing the plague, leading to horrific outbreaks of violence and persecution. The social fabric of Europe frayed under the weight of fear and death. For doctors themselves, the risks were immense. Many who treated the sick succumbed to the disease. Protective clothing offered little real safety, and close contact with patients all but guaranteed exposure. Some physicians refused to see plague victims, fearing for their own lives, while others stayed and died in service. The bravery or recklessness of those who remained made them both respected and pitied. To be a plague doctor was to live with death constantly at your side, to walk through streets filled with the stench of bodies, and to know that every patient you touched might also be your executioner. Despite the failures of medieval medicine against the plague, the Black Death left a profound legacy. It shattered faith in traditional medical practices and exposed the limits of humoral theory and astrology. At the same time, it spurred efforts to improve public health, leading to the first organized attempts at quarantine, sanitation, and record-keeping. It also reshaped society itself, as the massive loss of life altered economies, labor structures, and cultural attitudes. The trauma of the plague lingered for generations, haunting art, literature, and memory. For doctors, it was both a humbling and a defining experience, a reminder of the fragility of human knowledge in the face of nature's fury. To place yourself in the shoes of a plague doctor is to confront the unimaginable. Picture yourself stepping into a house where the family lies in agony, the air heavy with the scent of sickness and decay. You approach in your long robe and beaked mask, clutching a staff to prod patients without touching them. You prescribe vinegar washes, light fires to purify the air, and bleed a patient already weak with fever. You know, deep down, that these remedies are unlikely to work, but they are all you have. Outside, carts roll by, filled with corpses destined for mass graves. Bells toll constantly, marking the passing of countless souls. Each day is a cycle of suffering, futility, and fear. How long could you endure such a life before despair or death claimed you? The story of the plague doctor reminds us of the limits of medieval medicine and the resilience of those who practiced it. They faced an enemy invisible and unstoppable, armed with little more than tradition, superstition, and courage. Their failure was inevitable, but their efforts were not meaningless. They bore witness, provided what comfort they could, and laid the groundwork for the slow evolution of medicine toward greater understanding. In their strange costumes and desperate remedies, we see both the tragedy and the humanity of an age overwhelmed by disease. As we leave behind the nightmare of the Black Death, we turn to another brutal reality of medieval medicine: surgery without anesthesia. In the next chapter, we will explore how doctors and surgeons operated on the human body with nothing to dull the pain, and why even the bravest patients might wish they had never sought help at all. Few experiences in the medieval world could match the terror of undergoing surgery. Today, the thought of lying on an operating table brings anxiety, but we also know that anesthetics will put us to sleep and antiseptics will keep infection at bay. In the Middle Ages, neither of these mercies existed. Surgery was performed while patients were fully conscious, with little more than alcohol, a prayer, or sheer willpower to dull the pain. The surgeon's tools were sharp but crude, the environment unsanitary, and the risks overwhelming. To imagine yourself as a medieval doctor in this realm is to imagine holding a knife in your hand while a screaming, writhing patient struggles beneath you, knowing that survival depends on speed, luck, and perhaps divine intervention. The roots of surgery stretched back to antiquity, but in the medieval period, it was seen as a lower form of medicine compared to the theoretical work of physicians. Learned doctors in universities often disdained the practical work of cutting and stitching, leaving such tasks to barber-surgeons or other practitioners. Yet surgery was sometimes unavoidable. Battlefield injuries, accidents, infections, and broken bones demanded intervention, and so surgeons carved out a niche for themselves, combining practical experience with the limited medical theories of the day. Their work was dangerous, both for patients and for themselves, but it was also essential in a world where injuries were common and left untreated could be fatal. One of the most common surgical procedures was amputation. A crushed limb from a battlefield injury, a festering wound from infection, or gangrene spreading through a hand or foot could leave no other option. The surgeon would bind the limb above the affected area with a tourniquet, then cut swiftly through skin, muscle, and bone with a sharp knife or saw. The wound was cauterized with a red-hot iron to seal blood vessels and prevent excessive bleeding. For the patient, the pain was unimaginable. Screams echoed through the room. Bodies convulsed in agony, and many fainted from shock. Some died outright on the table, while others succumbed later to infection or blood loss. Yet for the few who survived, amputation could mean the difference between life and death. Trepanning, the act of drilling or cutting a hole in the skull, was another surgical practice, carried out for head injuries, seizures, or mental illness. Surgeons believed that opening the skull could relieve pressure or allow harmful humors to escape. With simple drills, chisels, and saws, they cut into bone while the patient lay conscious, restrained by assistants or family members. The risks were immense: infection, brain damage, or death. Yet archaeological evidence shows that some patients survived trepanning, their skulls showing signs of healing. This suggests that while crude, the procedure was not always fatal, and in rare cases, it may even have provided relief. Other surgeries included the lancing of abscesses, removal of bladder stones, and repair of hernias. Bladder stone surgery, known as lithotomy, was especially feared. Patients suffered excruciating pain from stones lodged in their urinary tract, and the only solution was for the surgeon to make an incision and attempt to extract the stone. The pain was indescribable, and the risks of infection enormous. Yet without the operation, patients faced years of agony or death from complications. Hernias, too, could be treated by crude surgical repair, though success was rare. The courage or desperation required to submit to such procedures cannot be overstated. Because there were no anesthetics, surgeons relied on various methods to dull pain, though none were effective by modern standards. Patients might be given alcohol, strong wine, or herbal preparations containing opium, henbane, or mandrake root. These substances could cause drowsiness or disorientation, but they did not eliminate pain. In many cases, patients were simply held down by assistants, their cries filling the room as the surgeon worked quickly. For the surgeon, speed was essential. The faster the cut was made, the less time the patient suffered, and the greater the chance of survival. A skilled surgeon prided himself on swiftness, his hands moving with practiced efficiency while chaos surrounded him. Cleanliness was another problem. The concept of germs was unknown, and instruments were rarely sterilized. Tools might be wiped on a cloth, rinsed in water, or even used repeatedly without cleaning. Surgeons often wore the same clothes from multiple operations, stained with blood from previous patients. Wounds were dressed with cloths that were not sterile, and healing relied more on luck and the patient's constitution than on medical skill. Infection was a constant danger, and many patients who survived the surgery itself died days later from sepsis or gangrene. To be a surgeon in this environment was to live with the knowledge that death followed your every action. Despite these grim realities, surgery did achieve some successes. Broken bones were set and healed, wounds were closed, and abscesses drained. Patients who might otherwise have died sometimes survived, and this gave surgery a measure of legitimacy. Texts such as those by Guy de Chauliac, a 14th century French surgeon, codified surgical practices and emphasized the importance of experience and observation. Guy's Chirurgia Magna became a standard reference, showing that surgery, while crude, was developing into a more organized field. His insistence on cleanliness, diet, and careful treatment, though still far from modern standards, represented a step toward better practice. For a modern person, the thought of standing in a medieval surgery is almost unbearable. Imagine the scene: a dimly lit room, the smell of blood and smoke from the cauterizing iron, the cries of the patient restrained on a rough table. The surgeon, his apron stained, works swiftly with knife and saw, his assistants handing him crude instruments. Sweat drips down his face as he hurries to finish before the patient loses too much blood or succumbs to shock. Outside, family members wait anxiously, praying for survival. Inside, time seems suspended between agony and hope. Even for the surgeon, the experience is harrowing. He knows that his skills are limited, his tools imperfect, and that death is as likely as life. Yet he continues, driven by duty, necessity, or perhaps the faint hope of success. It is difficult for us to imagine how patients found the courage to submit to such ordeals. Desperation surely played a role. A man with a gangrenous leg faced certain death without amputation, so he chose the small chance of survival despite the pain. A sufferer of bladder stones might endure the knife rather than live in constant torment. Others may have been persuaded by family or by faith, trusting that God would give them the strength to endure. For many, surgery was not a choice, but the only option left. Their bravery, or resignation, reminds us of the human capacity to endure suffering in the face of necessity. The legacy of medieval surgery is mixed. It was brutal and dangerous, yet it laid the foundation for future advances. Surgeons honed techniques, recorded their experiences, and gradually improved their methods. The emphasis on practical skill distinguished them from physicians, and over time, their work gained greater respect. By the Renaissance, surgery was beginning to emerge as a more formalized profession, benefiting from new discoveries in anatomy and experimentation. The horrors of medieval operations were not forgotten, but they became stepping stones on the long path toward modern surgery. For someone imagining themselves as a medieval doctor, the surgical arena would be the ultimate test. It demanded steady hands, iron nerves, and a willingness to inflict pain in the hope of saving life. It was a world where compassion and cruelty coexisted, where healing and harm were inseparable. To last even a single day in such a role would require strength beyond what most of us could summon. The cries of patients, the stench of infection, and the weight of responsibility would crush all but the most hardened. Yet for those who practiced it, surgery was both a craft and a calling, as necessary as it was dreadful. As we leave the surgeon's chamber, our journey turns back to the broader cultural forces that shaped medicine in the Middle Ages. In the next chapter, we will explore the role of religion and superstition, examining how faith guided treatments, how sin was seen as the cause of disease, and how spiritual remedies were often considered as important as physical ones. In the medieval world, medicine was not a separate science standing apart from faith. It was deeply entangled with religion, shaped by the Church's teachings, guided by spiritual beliefs, and infused with superstitions that touched nearly every part of life. Illness was rarely seen as a random misfortune or a natural process. Instead, it was often interpreted as the will of God, a punishment for sin, or a test of faith. To be a medieval doctor was not only to treat bodies, but to navigate the spiritual expectations of patients, clergy, and society itself. In this environment, religion and superstition were inseparable from medicine, influencing diagnosis, treatment, and the very understanding of disease. At the heart of medieval medicine was the belief that health and sickness reflected the state of the soul. The teachings of Christianity emphasized that suffering could be redemptive, a means of drawing closer to God or purging sin. Many believed that illnesses were inflicted by divine judgment, sent to correct moral failings or to remind people of their mortality. In this sense, disease was not just a physical condition, but a spiritual message. Doctors and patients alike approached healing not only as a matter of restoring the body, but also as a process of reconciling with God. Prayer, confession, and penance were often recommended alongside herbal remedies and diet. Superstition thrived in this world of uncertainty. Amulets, charms, and relics were widely used as protections against illness. A patient might wear a cross, a saint's medal, or a bag filled with herbs or written prayers, believing it would shield them from harm. Relics, bones, clothing, or objects associated with saints were considered especially powerful. Pilgrimages to holy sites were common, as sick people traveled in hope of miraculous cures. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, for example, drew countless pilgrims seeking healing, just as the waters of Lourdes do in modern times. For many, these spiritual remedies carried as much or more weight than the ministrations of doctors. Exorcisms and rituals were also part of medieval healing, particularly in cases of mental illness or unexplained symptoms. If a patient suffered seizures, hallucinations, or uncontrollable behavior, it might be interpreted as possession by demons. In such cases, the priest rather than the doctor became the healer, using prayers, holy water, and the sign of the cross to expel the evil. Even physical illnesses were sometimes treated with rituals designed to ward off evil spirits or curses. The line between medicine and magic blurred, and many treatments combined both. A charm might be recited while an herb was applied, or a spell might be written onto parchment and worn as protection. Astrology, too, had a spiritual dimension in this context. The stars were seen as part of God's creation, their movements a reflection of divine order. To consult an astrological chart was not necessarily viewed as pagan, but as an attempt to understand God's design. Still, the Church maintained a cautious stance, condemning practices that seemed to veer into fortune-telling, while tolerating those that framed astrology as a natural science. Doctors had to tread carefully, balancing their use of the stars with religious orthodoxy. Too much emphasis on celestial forces could invite accusations of heresy or sorcery. The Church's influence extended to medical institutions themselves. Many hospitals in the Middle Ages were founded by religious orders and dedicated to the care of the poor, the sick, and pilgrims. These hospitals emphasized spiritual healing as much as physical treatment, with chapels and clergy central to their operation. Patients were expected to pray, confess, and prepare their souls even as they received food, rest, and herbal remedies. Death was as common as recovery, and the hospital served as much as a place to die in peace as a place to be cured. Doctors who worked in such institutions understood that their role was as much pastoral as medical. Superstition flourished particularly in times of crisis. During the Black Death, for instance, when traditional remedies failed and death seemed unstoppable, people turned desperately to spiritual solutions. Processions of flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, hoping to appease God's wrath. Others sought scapegoats, accusing minority groups of poisoning wells or invoking curses. Fear magnified belief in magic, witchcraft, and curses, and doctors themselves were sometimes suspected of practicing sorcery when their treatments seemed strange or ineffective. In such an atmosphere, superstition was not merely tolerated, but embraced as a way of explaining the inexplicable. For the medieval doctor, this mingling of religion, superstition, and medicine was both a support and a burden. On the one hand, faith provided a framework for understanding illness and gave patients comfort. Doctors could prescribe prayer and pilgrimage alongside diet and herbs, reinforcing their authority. On the other hand, reliance on religion limited the scope of medical practice. A doctor who contradicted the Church's teachings risked accusations of heresy, while one who failed to acknowledge the spiritual dimension of illness might lose the trust of patients. Navigating this delicate balance required not only knowledge but diplomacy, as doctors worked under the watchful eyes of clergy and lay people alike. Imagine yourself as a medieval doctor confronted with a patient suffering from a fever and rash. You prescribe bloodletting and herbs, but the family insists that the illness is punishment for a sin. They ask whether a pilgrimage to a local shrine might help, or whether a relic should be placed near the patient's bed. You cannot dismiss these ideas outright without offending their beliefs, so you nod and encourage prayer alongside your treatments. In another case, a patient exhibits strange convulsions, and the family fears demonic possession. The priest is called, and you step aside as exorcisms are performed. Your role is secondary, your medical authority subsumed by spiritual concerns. To practice medicine in this environment is to accept that religion and superstition often hold equal or greater power than your knowledge. Yet we should not dismiss these practices entirely as foolish or harmful. In many cases, they provided real psychological comfort. To believe that illness had meaning, that it was part of a divine plan, gave suffering a purpose. Pilgrimages brought patients into contact with others, offering community and hope. Relics and charms gave patients a tangible sense of protection. Even if these remedies did not cure the body, they soothed the mind. And in times when medicine had little else to offer, that comfort was valuable. Healing, after all, is not only physical but emotional and spiritual. And medieval practices recognized this truth, even if their methods seem alien to us. Superstition also preserved some elements of practical wisdom. Charms and rituals often included herbs or practices that had real effects, hidden beneath layers of magic. For instance, garlic might be worn as a charm against evil, but it also had antimicrobial properties. Honey used in blessings could soothe wounds as well as spirits. The mingling of faith, superstition, and practical knowledge sometimes produced results, even if the reasoning was misunderstood. In this way, medieval medicine, though flawed, preserved fragments of truth within its tapestry of belief. For a modern person, stepping into this world would be disorienting. We are accustomed to separating science from religion, medicine from faith. To practice as a medieval doctor would mean accepting that your authority was limited, that your prescriptions were only part of the cure, and that prayer, relics, and charms were equally important in the eyes of your patients. It would mean enduring the frustration of seeing your treatments overshadowed by superstition, while also recognizing that those superstitions provided comfort in a fearful world. To last even a single day in this role would require patience, humility, and a willingness to embrace a worldview where body and soul were inseparable. The legacy of religion and superstition in medicine is profound. While many of these practices were abandoned with the rise of modern science, the idea that healing involves both mind and spirit remains. Hospitals still have chaplains, patients still pray for recovery, and many still turn to alternative remedies when conventional medicine fails. The medieval doctor, though constrained by superstition, reminds us that medicine is more than a technical skill. It is also a human relationship, shaped by belief, hope, and meaning. As we continue, we will leave behind the world of superstition and enter the halls of learning, where medieval universities sought to train physicians in the theory of medicine. In the next chapter, we will explore how medical texts in schools shaped the education of doctors, and why this education was as much about reading ancient authorities as it was about healing the sick. By the 12th and 13th centuries, medicine in Europe was slowly becoming a more structured and professionalized discipline, and much of that transformation was centered in the universities. If the apothecary's shop was a place of smells, herbs, and mixtures, and the barber-surgeon's shop was a place of blood, razors, and saws, then the university was a place of parchment, quills, and books. It was here that medicine was codified, debated, and taught as a learned profession, though what passed for education would seem strange to us today. Students did not study microbes or anatomy in the way modern medical students do. Instead, they spent years immersed in ancient texts, memorizing the words of long-dead authorities like Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna. For medieval doctors, the library was as important as the infirmary, and their education was more about theory and philosophy than about practice. The rise of medical schools in places like Salerno in Italy, Montpellier in France, and Bologna in Italy marked a turning point. These schools attracted students from across Europe, eager to study the healing arts under masters who claimed access to a tradition stretching back to Greece and Rome. Salerno, often called the first medical school in Europe, became famous for its teachings and for the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a widely circulated text that offered advice on health and hygiene. Montpellier gained renown for its liberal atmosphere and openness to new ideas, while Bologna became a center for anatomy, where dissections were sometimes performed, albeit under strict conditions. These universities formalized medicine as a profession, creating a class of physicians who distinguished themselves from barber-surgeons and folk healers through education and status. The curriculum was dominated by texts. Students studied the works of Hippocrates, whose aphorisms on health and disease were revered as timeless wisdom. They read Galen's extensive writings, which explained the theory of the four humors and offered detailed descriptions of anatomy and physiology, albeit based largely on animal dissections rather than human. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, translated from Arabic into Latin, became one of the most influential medical texts of the Middle Ages. It provided a comprehensive system of diagnosis and treatment, blending Greek philosophy with Islamic scholarship, and was studied for centuries in both Europe and the Islamic world. Other works by Arabic scholars, such as al-Razi, added to the body of knowledge. These texts formed the backbone of medical education, and mastery of them was the mark of a true physician. Teaching was conducted primarily through lectures. A master would read aloud from a text, often in Latin, while students listened, took notes, and memorized. Discussion and commentary followed, as the class analyzed the meaning of the words and debated their implications. Practical training was minimal. Students might observe dissections, if they were lucky, or watch demonstrations of certain procedures, but hands-on experience with patients was rare. Instead, the emphasis was on theory, on understanding the philosophical and logical framework that underpinned medicine. To be a physician was to be a scholar, someone who could interpret the wisdom of the ancients and apply it to contemporary cases. Examinations were rigorous, but theoretical. Students were tested on their knowledge of texts, their ability to explain concepts, and their skill in reasoning. A successful graduate earned the right to practice as a physician, often enjoying privileges and status denied to other medical practitioners. In many cities, only university-trained physicians were legally allowed to prescribe certain treatments or serve in official capacities. This professionalization created a hierarchy within medicine, with physicians at the top, surgeons and apothecaries below, and folk healers at the margins. Education thus became a gatekeeper, separating the learned from the unlearned, even if practical outcomes did not always favor the former. The reverence for texts could sometimes stifle innovation, because the words of Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna were treated with such authority. Questioning them was dangerous. Students were trained to interpret, not to experiment. Dissections, when permitted, were often conducted not to discover new truths, but to confirm what the texts already said. If the body did not match the book, it was the body that was thought to be in error, not the text. This reliance on authority meant that errors persisted for centuries. Galen's descriptions of anatomy, based on animal dissections, contained inaccuracies, yet they were repeated uncritically in medieval classrooms. Only much later, during the Renaissance, did scholars like Andreas Vesalius challenge these assumptions by conducting detailed human dissections and publishing corrected anatomical drawings. Despite these limitations, the universities did contribute to the growth of medicine. They preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations, ensuring that the writings of ancient and Islamic scholars were not lost. They created a shared language of medicine, centered on Latin, that allowed physicians from different countries to communicate and exchange ideas. They also fostered a sense of professional identity, with physicians seeing themselves as part of a learned community bound by common training and ethical standards. The oath to serve patients, drawn from Hippocratic traditions, reinforced this sense of duty, even if practice often fell short of ideals. The atmosphere of the medieval university was a mixture of solemn study and lively debate. Imagine a classroom where students in robes sit on wooden benches, their wax tablets or parchment sheets before them, while a master reads slowly from a heavy manuscript. The words of Galen or Avicenna fill the hall, echoed by the murmur of students repeating them to themselves. Questions arise, disputes are argued, and interpretations are compared. Outside the lecture halls, students gather in taverns or lodgings, debating philosophy late into the night. Medicine was not just about curing the sick. It was about belonging to a tradition, engaging with ideas that stretched across centuries and cultures. For patients, the education of their doctors could be both reassuring and alienating. A physician trained at Montpellier or Bologna carried prestige. His words weighted with the authority of the university. Wealthy patients valued this status and paid dearly for consultations. Yet the treatments offered might differ little from those of local healers, since both drew on humoral theory and herbal remedies. The physician's advantage lay not in better cures, but in social standing, his education, a marker of sophistication. For the poor, who could not afford such doctors, the world of universities mattered little. They continued to rely on midwives, wise women, or barber-surgeons, whose practical skills often proved more useful than a learned physician's theories. To imagine yourself as a medieval medical student is to imagine years of study filled with books rather than patients. You spend your days reading Latin texts, memorizing the qualities of the humors, the properties of herbs, and the influence of the stars. You attend lectures, copy manuscripts, and debate with fellow students. Hands-on practice is rare, and when you finally graduate, you step into the world as a physician with authority but little practical experience. Patients look to you for wisdom, and you recite the words of Galen or Avicenna, prescribing diets, purges, or bloodletting. Your education gives you confidence, but not certainty, and your success depends as much on faith and fortune as on learning. The legacy of medieval universities is complex. They did not produce doctors who could cure diseases in the way we expect today, but they created a framework for medicine as a profession. They preserved and transmitted knowledge, however flawed, and provided a foundation upon which later generations could build. Without them, the Renaissance breakthroughs in anatomy, physiology, and medical science might not have been possible. The medieval medical student, with his nose in a manuscript and his mind filled with humors and stars, was part of a long chain of inquiry that eventually led to modern medicine. For a modern person, stepping into that world would be both fascinating and frustrating. You would marvel at the manuscripts, the illuminated herbals, and the solemnity of the lectures. But you would long for real knowledge of the body, real tools to heal the sick. You would feel trapped in a system where authority mattered more than observation, where questioning was dangerous, and where the lives of patients depended on the words of long-dead masters. To survive even a day in such a role would demand patience, humility, and the ability to endure uncertainty. Yet it was this world of texts and universities that shaped the doctors of the Middle Ages, defining their role in society and their approach to healing. As we continue, we will turn to those often overlooked by the universities, but essential in the practice of medicine, the midwives and women healers. In the next chapter, we will explore the contributions of women to medieval medicine, the knowledge they preserved, and the accusations of witchcraft that often shadowed their work. In the grand lecture halls of medieval universities, women were almost entirely absent. Formal medical education was closed to them, and the profession of physician was dominated by men. Yet outside those walls, women played a crucial role in the practice of medicine. As midwives, nurses, and folk healers, they were often the first and most trusted caregivers in their communities. They attended births, treated common illnesses, and preserved traditions of herbal medicine that stretched back through generations. Their work was essential, though it rarely earned them recognition, and it was frequently shadowed by suspicion. In the eyes of some, women who healed with herbs and charms were wise and compassionate. In the eyes of others, they were witches dabbling in dangerous powers. To understand medieval medicine fully, we must step into the world of midwives and women healers, whose contributions were both vital and vulnerable. Midwifery was perhaps the most common and respected role for women in medicine. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a perilous ordeal, with high risks of death for both mother and child. In the absence of hospitals or physicians, midwives provided critical assistance. They were usually older women who had themselves borne children, giving them both experience and authority. They relied on practical knowledge, how to position the mother, how to recognize complications, and how to use herbs or oils to ease pain. Some used charms or prayers during the birth, blending medical practice with spiritual comfort. Their role extended beyond the physical delivery. They were caretakers of mothers and newborns, offering advice on nursing, recovery, and infant care. For countless families, the midwife was a lifeline, embodying both skill and compassion. Beyond childbirth, women healers provided remedies for everyday ailments. They gathered herbs from fields and forests, learning their properties through tradition and trial. Chamomile might be brewed to calm the stomach, yarrow applied to wounds, and sage used for fevers. Women passed this knowledge from mother to daughter, weaving it into the fabric of daily life. In villages where physicians were scarce or unaffordable, these local healers were the primary source of care. Their treatments, while rooted in folk wisdom, sometimes held real efficacy. The continuity of herbal medicine across centuries owes much to these women, whose informal practice preserved remedies that might otherwise have been lost. Despite their importance, women healers occupied a precarious position. Because they worked outside the formal structures of universities and guilds, their authority was always subject to challenge. Male physicians often dismissed them as unlearned, their cures as superstition. Worse, in times of fear or crisis, women healers could become targets of suspicion. The line between healing and witchcraft was thin in the medieval imagination. A woman who cured with herbs might be praised one day and accused of sorcery the next, especially if a patient failed to recover. Accusations of witchcraft grew more intense in the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period, leading to persecution and trials that destroyed many women who had devoted their lives to healing. The connection between women, healing, and magic was reinforced by cultural stereotypes. Women are often portrayed as closer to nature, more intuitive, and more prone to temptation. These qualities could be admired when they resulted in compassionate care, but feared when they seemed to cross into forbidden knowledge. Stories of witches brewing potions and casting spells echoed the real practices of women preparing herbal remedies. In some cases, the overlap was deliberate. Charms and prayers accompanied the use of herbs, creating treatments that straddled the line between medicine and magic. Patients often embraced these methods, valuing both their physical and spiritual dimensions. Authorities, however, sometimes saw danger in such ambiguity. Midwives, in particular, faced scrutiny. Because they presided over childbirth, a moment of both life and vulnerability, they wielded significant influence. Some were accused of using charms that the church disapproved of, or of secretly harming infants through negligence or malice. Manuals for inquisitors and clergy occasionally included warnings about midwives, reflecting fears that women who assisted at births might also conspire with the devil. While many midwives lived respected lives in their communities, others faced persecution, especially in periods of heightened fear of witchcraft. The irony is striking. Those who brought life into the world could also be accused of bringing evil. Yet the contributions of women to medieval medicine cannot be dismissed. Their knowledge of herbs, their skill in childbirth, and their role as community caregivers filled gaps that formal medicine could not. Physicians trained in universities rarely attended births or treated the poor. Barber-surgeons focused on procedures and injuries. Apothecaries provided remedies, but did not always offer care. Women stepped into these spaces, providing both treatment and comfort. Their work may not have been recorded in manuscripts or celebrated in history, but it was central to the health of countless families. Imagine yourself as a woman healer in a medieval village. Your days are filled with gathering herbs, drying them in bundles, and preparing salves and teas. Neighbors come to you with their ailments: a child with a fever, a farmer with a wound, a mother about to give birth. You offer what you can, guided by memory, tradition, and observation. Sometimes your remedies work, and gratitude fills your home. Other times they fail, and whispers of doubt spread. You live with the knowledge that your authority is fragile, that the same skills that earn you respect could also draw suspicion. A single accusation could change your life forever, turning healer into outcast. To survive in this role is to balance care with caution, compassion with fear. The legacy of women healers is preserved in fragments, in herbal manuscripts that recorded their remedies, in folklore that remembered their wisdom, and in the quiet continuity of traditions passed through generations. Even as universities excluded them and authorities persecuted them, women continued to heal, often in secret. Their resilience ensured that practical knowledge of plants and remedies survived into the modern era, when science could finally confirm their effectiveness. The line between superstition and science was not always clear, but within the work of these women lay the seeds of modern pharmacology and nursing. For a modern person, stepping into this world would be both empowering and perilous. You would feel the trust of your neighbors, the satisfaction of easing pain and welcoming new life. You would also feel the constant threat of suspicion, the weight of a society that valued your skills yet feared your independence. To last even a single day as a midwife or healer would require courage, patience, and resilience. It would mean accepting that your authority was always provisional, your safety always uncertain. Yet without you, many in your community would be left with no care at all. The story of women in medieval medicine reminds us that healing has always been more than a profession. It is a calling, a responsibility, and sometimes a risk. While their names are rarely remembered, midwives and women healers sustained their communities in ways that formal medicine could not. Their work was indispensable, even as it was undervalued. They remind us that history is not only written in the halls of universities or the practices of physicians, but also in the quiet, persistent labor of those who cared for others, often against the odds. As our journey continues, we will turn from local healers to the global connections of medieval medicine. In the next chapter, we will explore how exotic imports and the influence of Arabic and Islamic scholars enriched European medicine, introducing new ideas, remedies, and texts that reshaped the medieval understanding of health. While much of medieval European medicine was rooted in the writings of Greek and Roman authorities, it was the influence of Arabic and Islamic scholars that breathed new life into those traditions and introduced entirely new ideas. The medieval world was not isolated. Trade routes carried goods, ideas, and texts across continents. Spices from India, silk from China, and manuscripts from the Islamic world all found their way into Europe. Medicine was no exception. The contributions of Arab physicians and the exotic imports they recommended profoundly shaped medieval healing, blending cultures and creating a medical landscape that was broader and richer than it might otherwise have been. To understand the practice of medicine in Europe during the Middle Ages, one must also recognize the powerful influence of knowledge that came from far beyond its borders. The Islamic Golden Age, roughly spanning the 8th to the 13th centuries, was a period of remarkable intellectual flourishing. In centers such as Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic, preserving works that might otherwise have been lost. But they did more than preserve. They expanded upon the knowledge of Hippocrates and Galen, conducting their own observations, writing new commentaries, and integrating ideas from Persian, Indian, and other medical traditions. This vast synthesis produced works that would later be translated into Latin and studied in European universities. Without this chain of transmission, much of the ancient medical heritage would have vanished during the chaos of Europe as early Middle Ages. One of the most influential figures was Avicenna, known in the Islamic world as Ibn Sina. His monumental canon of medicine became the cornerstone of medical education in both East and West. Divided into 5 volumes, it covered everything from general principles and anatomy to specific diseases, treatments, and pharmacology. Avicenna emphasized systematic observation, classification, and logical reasoning. He discussed contagious diseases, the importance of climate and environment, and the role of diet and hygiene in health. His canon was translated into Latin in the 12th century and became a standard text in European universities, studied by students for centuries. To sit in a classroom in Montpellier or Bologna was often to listen to lectures on Avicenna as much as on Galen. Another towering figure was Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes. He wrote extensively on medicine, including works on smallpox and measles that were remarkably accurate for their time. His emphasis on clinical observation and distinguishing between different diseases represented a step forward in medical practice. He criticized blind adherence to authority, urging doctors to test and verify knowledge through experience. Though his skepticism sometimes clashed with European reverence for tradition, his works nevertheless enriched the medieval medical canon. The spirit of inquiry he embodied foreshadowed the more empirical approaches that would eventually dominate modern science. These scholars were not working in isolation. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, for example, brought together translators and scholars from diverse backgrounds who rendered Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. This exchange created a vast reservoir of medical knowledge that flowed outward along trade and intellectual networks. When European scholars encountered these works, often in Spain or Sicily, where Islamic and Christian cultures met, they translated them into Latin. The result was a revival of medical learning in Europe, sometimes called the 12th century Renaissance. Without the translations and innovations of Islamic scholars, the curriculum of European medical schools would have been far poorer. Exotic imports also played a role in reshaping medieval medicine. Alongside manuscripts came new remedies, herbs, and spices. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger, brought from Asia through Islamic trade routes, were prized not only for their flavor, but for their supposed medicinal properties. They were classified according to the humoral system. Ginger, for example, was considered warming and useful against cold illnesses, while cinnamon was believed to aid digestion and circulation. These spices became staples in the apothecary's shop, though their high cost limited them to the wealthy. To prescribe a remedy containing cinnamon or nutmeg was to demonstrate sophistication and access to global trade. Other imports included substances like camphor, musk, and aloe. Camphor, derived from trees in Asia, was used for fevers and as a cooling agent. Musk, an aromatic substance from deer glands, was prized as both a perfume and a medicine, believed to invigorate the heart and brain. Aloe, imported from the Middle East and Africa, was used for wounds, digestive problems, and as a purgative. These exotic materials lent an air of mystery and potency to treatments, enhancing the apothecary's reputation and the physician's authority. Patients often believed that the more distant and rare the ingredient, the more powerful its effect. The flow of ideas and goods was not one way. European scholars and physicians also engaged with these texts, sometimes blending them with Christian theology and local traditions. The result was a hybrid medicine that combined Galenic theory, Islamic scholarship, and European superstition. A physician might quote Avicenna while prescribing a pilgrimage to a shrine, or cite Rhazes while also recommending bloodletting. This synthesis reflected the interconnectedness of the medieval world, where knowledge crossed cultural and religious boundaries despite wars and rivalries. Medicine became a shared human endeavor, transcending divisions even in an age of crusades and conflict. The influence of Arab medicine also extended to hospitals. The Islamic world had developed sophisticated hospital systems, such as those in Baghdad and Cairo, where patients were treated, medical students trained, and texts studied. These institutions emphasized cleanliness, organization, and systematic care. When European travelers and scholars encountered them, they brought back ideas that influenced the development of hospitals in Europe. Though European hospitals were more closely tied to religious institutions and spiritual care, the organizational models of Islamic hospitals left their mark. For a modern person imagining themselves as a medieval doctor, the encounter with these exotic imports and foreign texts would be both bewildering and enlightening. You might sit in a university lecture, hearing Latin translations of Avicenna's canon, marveling at the breadth of his knowledge. You might prescribe cinnamon or camphor to a wealthy patient, explaining their humoral properties while secretly relying on the prestige of their foreign origins. You might find yourself defending the use of these remedies against skeptics who distrusted anything outside traditional Christian frameworks. To practice medicine in this environment was to navigate not only bodies and illnesses, but cultures and traditions, blending local and global in a single prescription. The story of Arab influence on European medicine also challenges the notion of the Middle Ages as a time of stagnation. While Europe did struggle with war, famine, and plague, it was also part of a wider world of exchange and learning. The medicine of the Middle Ages was not purely European. It was shaped by ideas and ingredients from across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. This global dimension gave medieval doctors tools and concepts they would not otherwise have had, even if their understanding was limited by the frameworks of humors and superstition. To last a single day as a medieval doctor in this context would mean balancing ancient authority, new ideas, and patient expectations. You would be both scholar and cultural broker, translating not only texts but traditions. You would prescribe ginger and honey to one patient, bloodletting to another, and prayer to a third, all the while believing you were drawing from a vast and interconnected body of knowledge. The truth was that much of it remained ineffective against serious diseases, but it provided structure, meaning, and the hope of healing in a fearful world. The legacy of Arab influence on European medicine is lasting. The texts of Avicenna and Rhesses continued to be studied well into the Renaissance, shaping the thought of scholars who would eventually challenge and surpass them. The exotic imports that filled apothecaries' shelves remain part of our kitchens and pharmacies today, their medicinal properties sometimes confirmed by modern science. The idea of medicine as a global exchange of knowledge endures, reminding us that healing has always been a human endeavor that crosses borders. As we move forward, we will turn from the global to the deeply personal. In the next chapter, we will explore the peculiar practice of urine examination and diagnosis, where physicians peered into glass flasks of liquid, sniffing, tasting, and studying color to divine the mysteries of the body. In the medieval world, where medical tools were crude and scientific understanding limited, one object stood at the center of diagnosis: a flask of urine. Physicians of the Middle Ages considered urine to be a mirror of the body's inner state, a liquid that revealed the secrets of health and disease. To us, it may sound odd, even distasteful, but to a medieval doctor, no examination was complete without it. Patients were often asked to provide a sample, which the physician would then study with great seriousness, holding the glass vessel up to the light, swirling its contents, smelling it, and sometimes even tasting it. The practice was known as uroscopy, and it became so widespread that the image of a doctor holding a flask of urine became an enduring symbol of medicine throughout the period. To understand how medieval doctors approached illness, we must step into this peculiar world of liquid clues and colorful charts. The roots of uroscopy lay in ancient medicine, particularly in the works of Hippocrates and Galen, who had noted connections between urine and health. These ideas were preserved and expanded in the Islamic world, where scholars such as Avicenna wrote detailed descriptions of urinary analysis. By the time these texts reached Europe, uroscopy had become an established diagnostic tool, forming a cornerstone of medical practice. Physicians believed that urine reflected the balance of the humors, with its color, consistency, smell, and even taste offering evidence of excesses or deficiencies. To examine urine was to peer into the hidden workings of the body. Urine flasks, known as machillae, were standard equipment for physicians. These glass vessels were usually round at the bottom, with a narrow neck, allowing the doctor to swirl the liquid and observe its qualities. The matula was so iconic that it appeared in paintings, manuscripts, and even satirical works that mocked doctors' reliance on it. Patients often carried their urine to the physician in such a flask, sometimes traveling miles with it. There was even a practice called urine casting, where a messenger would deliver a flask to the doctor, who would make a diagnosis without ever seeing the patient in person. While this may seem absurd to us, it reflects how central urine was to medical thinking. Color was the first and most important clue. Doctors consulted elaborate charts, known as urine wheels, which depicted different shades and their corresponding meanings. Pale, watery urine was thought to indicate an excess of phlegm, while deep red urine might point to too much blood or heat in the system. Dark, blackish urine was ominous, often signaling serious illness or impending death. Yellow urine could suggest an abundance of bile. These interpretations were deeply tied to the humoral system, reinforcing the idea that all bodily fluids reflected the balance of the four humors. The physician's task was to interpret the language of color and connect it to the patient as symptoms. Beyond color, doctors studied clarity, consistency, and sediment. Cloudy urine might indicate impurities, while clear urine suggested health. A thick or viscous quality could point to digestive problems, and sediments at the bottom of the flask were thought to represent imbalances in digestion or the breakdown of humors. Physicians held the flask up to candlelight, tilting it to see how the liquid moved, as though it contained a map of the body's hidden state. Some even drew comparisons to the stars, seeing the swirling of urine as reflecting cosmic influences, tying uroscopy back to astrology and the interconnectedness of all things. Smell and taste were also part of the analysis. Physicians might sniff the flask, noting whether the odor was sweet, foul, or acrid. In some cases, they even tasted the urine, believing that sweetness indicated diseases like diabetes, though they lacked the modern concept of sugar in the blood. This willingness to engage so directly with the patient fluids reflects both the seriousness with which doctors took uroscopy and the limited tools they had at their disposal. Without microscopes, thermometers, or stethoscopes, they relied on their senses sight, smell, taste, touch to make judgments. For patients, the ritual of uroscopy could be reassuring. It gave the impression of precision and attention, as the doctor carefully examined the flask, consulted his charts, and delivered a diagnosis. The symbolism of the matula reinforced the physician's authority, as if he possessed the ability to see inside the body without cutting it open. Even if the conclusions were often wrong, the process gave patients confidence that something was being done. In an age of uncertainty, the ritual itself was a form of care. Yet uroscopy was not without its critics. Some mocked it as little more than guesswork dressed up in ritual. Satirical poems and plays poked fun at doctors who claimed to diagnose all ailments by staring into a flask of urine. Quacks and charlatans sometimes exploited the practice, offering diagnoses at fairs and markets to anyone who brought them a sample. Despite these criticisms, uroscopy persisted for centuries, a testament to both its cultural resonance and the lack of better alternatives. Even as anatomy and dissection advanced in the Renaissance, the urine flask remained a symbol of medicine. To imagine yourself as a medieval doctor practicing uroscopy is to imagine standing in a dimly lit room, holding a glass flask up to a flickering candle. You swirl the liquid, watching its color shift from pale yellow to amber. You compare it to a chart on parchment, noting its similarity to one shade associated with fevers. You sniff it, wrinkle your nose, and perhaps touch a drop to your tongue. You announce your diagnosis: an imbalance of humors, too much heat in the blood, requiring bleeding and a cooling diet. The patient nods, reassured by your certainty, even if the outcome will not change. For you, the ritual is not a gimmick, but a central part of your art, the way you make sense of the mysteries of the body. Uroscopy also reflected a deeper cultural fascination with bodily fluids. In a world where the humors explained everything from health to personality, the study of urine was part of a broader attempt to find meaning in the body's excretions. Just as astrologers read the stars and priests interpreted scripture, doctors read urine, seeking signs of hidden truths. This symbolic dimension gave uroscopy a power that went beyond medicine. It was part of the medieval quest to find order in a world of chaos, to interpret signs and connect the visible with the invisible. For a modern person, stepping into this world would be deeply unsettling. We rely on blood tests, x-rays, and scans, not the color of a flask of urine, to guide diagnosis. To make life and death decisions based on such limited evidence would feel reckless, even terrifying. Yet in the absence of better tools, medieval doctors did what they could with what they had. The urine flask may not have revealed the true causes of disease, but it gave structure to the practice of medicine and reinforced the doctor's role as interpreter of the body's secrets. To last even a single day in such a role would mean accepting a level of uncertainty that few of us could tolerate. The legacy of uroscopy is curious. While it has long since been abandoned as a primary diagnostic tool, its echoes remain in modern medicine. Doctors still analyze urine for clues, though now with microscopes and chemical tests rather than the naked eye. The connection between urine and health is real, even if the medieval methods were crude. In this sense, Uroscopy was not entirely misguided. It was simply limited by the tools and theories of its time. As we move forward, we will turn to a very different side of medieval medicine, the world of quacks and charlatans, those who traveled from town to town, selling miracle cures and performing spectacles of healing. In the next chapter, we will explore how false doctors thrived in a world of uncertainty, preying on hope and fear, and why their presence was both dangerous and inevitable. Wherever there is suffering, there will always be those who try to profit from it. In the Middle Ages, when disease struck without warning and medicine often failed to provide real cures, people were desperate for hope. Into this environment stepped the quacks and charlatans, men and sometimes women who claimed to possess miracle remedies, secret knowledge, or magical powers. They traveled from town to town, setting up stalls in markets, performing dramatic cures in public squares, and selling potions that promised to heal everything from headaches to plague. Some were clever showmen, others skilled tricksters, and a few may have even believed in their own remedies. But for the medieval patient, unable to distinguish science from sham, these figures embodied both promise and peril. To encounter them is to see how fragile trust in medicine could be, and how easily it could be manipulated. The line between genuine healer and quack was not always clear. Even licensed physicians relied on theories that we now know to be false, such as the four humors in astrology. Apothecaries sold remedies made from herbs and minerals, whose effects were uncertain. Barber-surgeons performed procedures that often did more harm than good. Against this backdrop, a charlatan's claims did not always seem outlandish. A traveling doctor might promise relief with a potion of rare herbs, a charm blessed by saints, or a secret recipe handed down through generations. For patients who had tried everything else, the chance of a miracle cure was irresistible. In a world of pain and fear, hope was a commodity as valuable as gold. Markets and fairs were the main stage for these performers. On market day, when villagers gathered to buy and sell goods, a quack might set up a brightly painted wagon and draw a crowd with music, jokes, or bold speeches. Assistants, sometimes planted in the audience, would claim to be healed on the spot, collapsing dramatically, only to rise moments later, cured. The quack would then display bottles of colored liquids, jars of ointments, or packets of powders, each described in glowing terms as the key to health. He might claim his remedy could cure headaches, fevers, toothaches, stomach troubles, or even the plague itself. The performance was as important as the product, for spectacle attracted customers and confidence inspired belief. Some charlatans relied on exotic ingredients to lend credibility. They boasted of medicines made with spices from the East, minerals from distant lands, or secret plants discovered in hidden valleys. Others invoked religion, claiming their potions were blessed by saints or infused with holy relics. A few pretended to be university-trained physicians, dressing in robes and speaking in Latin phrases to impress the crowd. In an age when literacy was rare and science poorly understood, such performances could be convincing. The spectacle of authority was often enough to persuade desperate patients to hand over their coins. The remedies themselves varied widely. Some were harmless mixtures of herbs, wine, or honey, offering little more than a placebo effect. Others contained dangerous ingredients like mercury, arsenic, or lead, which could poison the patient over time. Alcohol was a common base, giving patients a warming sensation that felt like healing. Ointments might include animal fats, ground bones, or even dried blood, substances thought to carry mystical or medicinal properties. Pills and powders were wrapped in paper and sold in bulk, their composition a mystery to the buyer. The lack of regulation meant that anyone could claim to be a healer, and there was little recourse for those harmed by false cures. Charlatans also offered services beyond potions. Tooth pulling was a common spectacle, with quacks yanking rotten teeth from patients in front of cheering crowds. Bone setting and minor surgeries were attempted, often with disastrous results. Some claimed to exorcise demons or lift curses, combining healing with ritual and performance. Others sold love potions, fertility charms, or concoctions to ensure good luck. In this way, quackery was not just about medicine, but about addressing the full range of human hopes and fears. For villagers with few options, the charlatan's promises, however hollow, offered a glimmer of control in a world of uncertainty. Reactions to these figures were mixed. Many ordinary people trusted them, at least enough to spend money on their remedies. Others viewed them with suspicion, aware that their promises were too good to be true. Authorities sometimes cracked down on quacks, especially in cities where guilds of physicians and apothecaries sought to protect their own monopolies. Laws were passed requiring licenses or forbidding the sale of unapproved remedies. Yet enforcement was difficult, and charlatans often slipped away before they could be punished, moving on to the next town where no one yet knew their reputation. The itinerant nature of their work made them hard to catch, and their ability to charm crowds gave them protection. For a medieval doctor trained in universities, quacks were both rivals and embarrassments. On the one hand, they competed for patients, offering cheaper and more dramatic treatments. On the other hand, their failures reflected poorly on medicine as a whole, reinforcing public skepticism. A physician might sneer at a quack's antics, yet he could not deny their popularity. In some cases, even physicians resorted to showmanship, exaggerating their own abilities to attract clients. The boundary between professional and charlatan was not always as firm as we might like to imagine. Imagine yourself as a medieval patient suffering from chronic pain or a lingering fever. The local physician has prescribed bloodletting, which only left you weaker. The apothecary's herbs provided no relief. Then one day, in the bustle of the marketplace, you see a man in colorful clothes, his wagon filled with bottles that gleam in the sunlight. He speaks confidently, telling stories of miraculous cures, his voice rising above the crowd. He offers a potion, just a few coins for relief. You hesitate, then hand over the money, drinking the bitter liquid with hope in your heart. Perhaps it helps, perhaps it doesn't, but in that moment, you feel as if you've taken action, and that sense of control itself brings comfort. This is the power of the charlatan, not in curing, but in convincing. For a modern person imagining themselves as a medieval doctor, confronting quacks would be infuriating. You would see them undermining trust in medicine, selling dangerous remedies, and deceiving patients. Yet you would also recognize that your own treatments, bloodletting, purging, or astrological timing were not always more effective. The difference lay in authority and intention. You believed you were following a tradition of science and learning, while the charlatan was a performer chasing profit. Still, patients judged by results, and when both failed equally often, the line between doctor and quack blurred dangerously. To survive in this world as a healer, you had to accept competition not only from colleagues, but from charlatans who wielded hope as their weapon. The legacy of quackery is long. Even as medicine advanced, charlatans did not disappear. In the Renaissance and beyond, snake oil salesmen, miracle cure peddlers, and fraudulent healers continued to thrive. Their methods adapted with the times, but the essence remained the same, offering hope where science struggled, profiting from fear and desperation. The medieval quack reminds us that the human desire for easy cures is timeless, and that wherever uncertainty exists, there will be those who exploit it. As we leave the noisy market stalls of charlatans, our journey takes us to the battlefield, where surgeons face the brutal realities of war. In the next chapter, we will explore how medieval armies treated their wounded, the crude methods of battlefield medicine, and the desperate struggle to save lives amid the chaos of combat. Of all the arenas where medieval medicine was tested, none was more brutal than the battlefield. Here, amid the clash of swords, the whistle of arrows, and the thunder of siege engines, men fell wounded in numbers that overwhelmed the resources of even the most skilled healers. Unlike the steady work of an apothecary's shop or the quiet rhythm of a monastery infirmary, Battlefield medicine was a chaotic, bloody, and desperate endeavor. Surgeons faced injuries of staggering severity, often with little more than crude tools, makeshift shelters, and the courage to act quickly in impossible circumstances. To understand what it meant to be a medieval doctor or surgeon, one must imagine kneeling beside a wounded knight or peasant soldier, with blood pooling in the mud and cries of agony echoing across the field, knowing that survival depended on both speed and chance. The weapons of medieval warfare inflicted horrific wounds. Swords sliced through flesh and bone, leaving gaping cuts that bled profusely. Axes and maces shattered skulls and crushed limbs, producing injuries that could not be easily repaired. Arrows pierced deep into the body, sometimes lodging in joints or organs where removal was treacherous. Crossbow bolts struck with such force that they could penetrate armor, leaving jagged wounds. Spears and pikes thrust into the abdomen or chest caused internal damage that no surgeon could hope to repair with the knowledge of the time. Siege engines hurled stones that shattered bodies, while boiling oil or burning pitch poured from castle walls caused devastating burns. The variety and severity of these wounds challenged even the most experienced battlefield surgeons. Treatment began as soon as the wounded could be retrieved from the battlefield, often carried on makeshift stretchers or slung over horses. Surgeons and their assistants worked in tents or nearby shelters, with little light, poor sanitation, and a constant flow of casualties. The first priority was to stop bleeding. This could be done by applying pressure, bandages, or cauterization with hot irons. In some cases, arteries were tied off with crude ligatures, though this was not always effective. Pain was intense, and with no anesthetics beyond strong wine or herbal concoctions, patients often screamed or lost consciousness. Surgeons worked quickly, knowing that hesitation could mean death. Amputations were common, especially when limbs were crushed, mangled, or infected. A surgeon would bind the limb, cut swiftly with a knife or saw, and then cauterize the wound with fire. Survival depended on the patient's strength and the cleanliness of the wound, though infection was almost inevitable. Arrow and bolt wounds presented another challenge. If the shaft could be seen, it might be pulled out, but barbed heads often lodged deep, tearing flesh when removed. Special tools were developed to extract arrowheads, but the process was agonizing and often fatal if major organs or blood vessels were involved. Sometimes surgeons chose to push the arrow through rather than pull it out, a decision that was as dangerous as it was painful. Burns and fractures were also frequent. Boiling liquids, flaming projectiles, and incendiary weapons left soldiers with blistered, charred skin. Treatment involved cooling with water, applying ointments, or covering with cloths soaked in wine or vinegar. Broken bones were set with splints or bandages, though the lack of X-rays or knowledge of internal anatomy made precise repairs impossible. Soldiers who survived these treatments often lived with permanent disabilities, scars, or deformities, carrying the marks of battle for the rest of their lives. Yet the fact that any survived at all is a testament to the skill and determination of those who treated them. Not all care was surgical. Diet, rest, and spiritual comfort played important roles. Surgeons and attendants provided broth, bread, and water to strengthen patients, while priests offered prayers and last rites. In many cases, the presence of a chaplain was as important as that of a surgeon, for soldiers faced death with as much fear for their souls as for their bodies. The battlefield was not only a medical arena, but a spiritual one, where salvation and healing were sought side by side. To a medieval soldier, to die without confession was as terrifying as to die from wounds. The organization of battlefield medicine varied depending on the army and the resources available. Wealthy knights often brought their own personal surgeons, while common soldiers relied on whatever help the army could provide. In larger campaigns, tents or rudimentary hospitals were set up behind the lines, staffed by surgeons, assistants, and servants. Supplies included bandages, herbs, wine, and basic instruments such as knives, saws, and forceps. Yet shortages were constant, and improvisation was necessary. A cloak might serve as a bandage, a heated sword as a cauterizing iron. Surgeons learned to adapt, using whatever was at hand to preserve life in desperate circumstances. The emotional toll on surgeons must have been immense. Imagine standing in a tent filled with groaning, bleeding men, each looking to you for relief. You move from one to the next, binding wounds, sawing through bone, or whispering prayers. You know that many will not survive, no matter what you do. The weight of responsibility is crushing, the atmosphere thick with the smell of blood, smoke, and fear. To endure such scenes day after day required not only skill but also resilience, a hardened spirit that could continue working even when hope was slim. Some surgeons likely grew numb, focusing on technique rather than emotion, while others must have carried the burden of their failures for the rest of their lives. Despite the grim realities, battlefield medicine did lead to some progress. The sheer scale of injuries forced surgeons to develop practical skills and techniques that were less common in civilian practice. They learned how to amputate quickly, how to manage blood loss, and how to deal with trauma. Experience on the battlefield honed their craft, making them more effective in treating wounds than many university-trained physicians who dealt mostly in theory. Texts written by surgeons such as Henry de Mondeville and Guy de Chauliac reflected this practical knowledge, blending battlefield experience with academic learning. In this sense, war, though destructive, pushed the boundaries of medical practice. For a modern person, the idea of practicing battlefield medicine in the Middle Ages is almost unimaginable. Without anesthesia, antibiotics, or sterile environments, the odds of saving patients were slim. You would face a torrent of suffering with few tools to fight it, your hands stained with blood, your ears filled with cries. Each decision would be a gamble, each cut a risk. To last even a single day in such a role would demand courage beyond measure, and even then, the psychological toll might be unbearable. Yet for those who lived it, it was a necessary duty, as essential as wielding a sword or defending a castle wall. The legacy of medieval battlefield medicine lies in its blend of brutality and necessity. It reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, people strove to heal, to preserve life against overwhelming odds. Their efforts were imperfect, often tragic, but they represented the resilience of the human spirit. To be a surgeon on a medieval battlefield was to live at the edge of despair and determination, where every action carried the weight of life and death. As we leave the mud and blood of the battlefield, our journey turns to the quieter but equally important world of hospitals and care for the poor. In the next chapter, we will explore how medieval hospitals emerged, what role they played in society, and why their focus was often more spiritual than medical. When we think of hospitals today, we picture large, bustling institutions filled with doctors, nurses, and advanced equipment designed to diagnose, treat, and cure. In the Middle Ages, however, the word hospital meant something very different. Medieval hospitals were less about curing diseases and more about providing shelter, comfort, and spiritual care. They were places where the poor, the sick, the orphaned, and the traveler could find food, a bed, and the attention of clerics or caretakers. In many ways, they were charitable institutions, run by religious orders and supported by donations, rather than medical facilities in the modern sense. To imagine yourself as a medieval doctor in such a setting is to imagine working in an environment where the line between spiritual salvation and physical healing was thin, and where the goal was often to ease suffering rather than to cure it. The origins of hospitals in medieval Europe were closely tied to Christianity. Inspired by the teachings of Christ and the example of the Good Samaritan, the Church emphasized care for the poor and the sick as acts of mercy. Monasteries had long served as centers of healing, but by the 11th and 12th centuries, separate hospitals began to appear in towns and cities. These were often founded by bishops, nobles, or wealthy merchants as acts of piety, their endowments ensuring prayers for their souls, as well as tangible help for the needy. To establish a hospital was not only an act of charity, but also a way of gaining prestige and spiritual merit. The patients of these hospitals were diverse. They included the destitute, who had no home or means of support, pilgrims traveling to holy sites, orphans and abandoned children, the elderly who could no longer work, and, of course, the sick. In many hospitals, all these groups lived side by side, sharing communal dormitories or halls. Beds, if provided, were simple, often shared by 2 or more people. Cleanliness was difficult to maintain, and disease spread easily in such crowded conditions. Yet for those who had nowhere else to turn, the hospital offered refuge, warmth, and food. It was often the only safety net available in a world without social welfare or state-supported health care. The care provided in hospitals varied. Some employed physicians or surgeons, particularly in larger towns, but many relied primarily on clergy and lay brothers or sisters to tend to the sick. Their focus was on comfort rather than cure, providing nourishment, clean clothing, and spiritual guidance. Patients were expected to confess their sins, receive the sacraments, and prepare their souls for either recovery or death. Prayer and religious rituals were central to the hospital's mission. Chapels were often attached to the wards so that patients could hear Mass from their beds. Healing, in this context, was understood as both physical and spiritual, with salvation of the soul considered even more important than recovery of the body. Some hospitals specialized in particular types of care. Leper hospitals, or leprosaria, were established to isolate and care for those suffering from leprosy, a disease feared for its disfiguring effects and believed to be highly contagious. These institutions were often located outside city walls, reflecting both compassion and fear. Leprosy carried a heavy stigma, associated not only with illness, but also with sin, and lepers were frequently marginalized. Yet leprosaria provided them with food, shelter, and community, even if no real cure was available. Other hospitals focused on pilgrims, offering lodging along popular routes such as the Camino de Santiago. Still others cared primarily for the elderly, functioning as medieval equivalents of almshouses. The organization of hospitals reflected both charity and hierarchy. Wealthier patients or benefactors might receive private rooms or better food, while the poor crowded into common halls. Donations of money, land, or goods supported the institution, and in return, the benefactors' names were remembered in prayers and commemorated in records. This spiritual economy tied hospitals into the broader religious life of society, reinforcing the idea that caring for the sick was as much about saving souls as about saving lives. For staff, service in a hospital was a form of religious devotion, an opportunity to embody Christian charity in daily life. The medical treatments offered in hospitals were limited but not non-existent. Herbal remedies were administered, diets adjusted, and wounds dressed. In some larger hospitals, trained physicians visited patients, prescribing bloodletting or purges according to humoral theory. Surgeons might be called upon to treat injuries, though their work was constrained by the lack of facilities. Apothecaries sometimes supplied medicines ranging from simple herbs to complex compounds like theriac, yet the emphasis remained on comfort. A patient who died peacefully, having confessed and received the sacraments, was considered to have been healed in the most important sense, even if their body succumbed to disease. For a modern person, stepping into a medieval hospital would be a shocking experience. Instead of sterile white halls and quiet wards, you would find large, open spaces filled with rows of rough beds or straw pallets. Patients from all walks of life, sick, poor, elderly, orphaned, would be crowded together, their groans and prayers mingling with the chants of clerics. The smell would be overwhelming, a mixture of unwashed bodies, illness, and incense. Caretakers would move among the beds, offering bowls of broth, changing bandages, and murmuring prayers. Physicians, if present, might make their rounds briefly, prescribing bloodletting or herbs before moving on. The atmosphere would feel more like a church than a clinic, more about preparing for death than about fighting it. Hospitals also served as symbols of civic pride. In cities, they demonstrated the wealth and piety of their founders. Impressive buildings with chapels, cloisters, and halls were constructed to house them, making them visible signs of charity and Christian duty. They were places where the ideals of mercy and community were made concrete, where the sick and poor could be cared for in the name of God. For medieval society, the hospital was as much a spiritual institution as a medical one, reflecting the inseparable bond between religion and medicine. Yet these institutions also reveal the limitations of medieval medicine. Without understanding of germs, contagion, or hygiene, hospitals could become breeding grounds for disease. Patients crowded together spread infections rapidly, and mortality rates were high. The emphasis on spiritual care sometimes overshadowed attempts at physical healing. For doctors, working in such conditions could be frustrating, their treatments undermined by the environment itself. Yet within the framework of medieval belief, hospitals fulfilled their purpose. They provided charity, dignity, and the promise of salvation. To imagine yourself as a medieval doctor in a hospital is to imagine walking through a hall filled with suffering, armed with little more than herbs, bloodletting tools, and prayers. You prescribe what you can, but you know that many will not survive. You hear confessions as often as you give remedies, and you measure success not in cures, but in the peace with which your patients meet their end. It is a role that demands humility, patience, and faith as much as knowledge or skill. To last even a day in such an environment would be to confront the limits of medicine and the enduring power of compassion. The legacy of medieval hospitals is lasting. Though their focus was more spiritual than medical, they laid the groundwork for later institutions. They introduced the idea of organized care, communal facilities, and dedicated staff. They embodied the principle that society has a responsibility to care for its vulnerable members. As medical knowledge advanced, hospitals evolved into centers of treatment, but their roots remained in the charity and devotion of the Middle Ages. In this sense, the medieval hospital was both primitive and profound, a reflection of a world where healing the soul was as important as healing the body. As we move forward, we will turn to the strange and sometimes dangerous world of magical cures and superstitions. In the next chapter, we will explore the charms, spells, and mystical remedies that filled the gaps left by formal medicine, and how they shaped the lives of both doctors and patients. When medicine falters, people often turn to magic. In the Middle Ages, where medical knowledge was limited and disease omnipresent, magical cures and superstitions flourished. They filled the gaps left by humoral theory, herbal remedies, and surgical procedures, offering hope where none seemed possible. For the medieval patient, magic was not a separate realm opposed to medicine, but an extension of it, interwoven with religion, astrology, and folk tradition. To imagine yourself as a medieval doctor is to imagine navigating a world where charms, spells, and talismans were as much a part of healing as herbs or bloodletting, and where your patients expected you to engage with these practices whether you believed in them or not. The belief in magical cures rested on the conviction that illness could be caused by forces beyond the visible. Evil spirits, curses, or the malice of neighbors might afflict the body just as surely as spoiled food or an imbalance of humors. To combat these unseen dangers, protective measures were necessary. Amulets and charms were common, worn around the neck, tied to clothing, or placed under pillows. These might include pieces of parchment inscribed with prayers, herbs sewn into little bags, or objects such as stones, bones, or coins believed to carry protective power. A patient might be given a charm against fever or a talisman to ward off plague. The mere presence of these objects was thought to repel illness and attract health. Spells and incantations were also part of the healing repertoire. These were often a blend of Christian prayers, biblical verses, and older pagan traditions. A healer might recite a psalm while applying an herb, or whisper a charm as a wound was bandaged. The spoken word was believed to carry power, shaping reality through divine or mystical means. Some spells invoked saints, angels, or even the Virgin Mary, asking for intercession. Others called upon natural forces or obscure names believed to hold secret strength. For patients, the ritual of hearing these words provided reassurance, creating a sense that the illness was being fought on multiple fronts, both physical and spiritual. Astrological magic overlapped with medical practice as well. Since the stars were believed to influence health, charms and spells were often timed to specific planetary alignments. A healer might recommend wearing a charm inscribed under the influence of Jupiter for strength or under Venus for fertility. Talismans bearing zodiacal symbols were thought to channel cosmic energy into the body. Physicians themselves, trained in astrology, sometimes prescribed these measures, blurring the line between learned medicine and folk magic. To refuse entirely would risk alienating patients who believed deeply in the power of the heavens. Superstitions about specific remedies abounded. To cure a fever, one might carry an egg in the pocket or tie frog bones around the neck. To relieve toothache, a charm might be written on parchment and pressed against the jaw. Warts were treated by rubbing them with a piece of bacon and then burying the bacon in the ground, the belief being that as the bacon rotted, the wart would vanish. Some remedies involved transferring illness to objects or animals, touching a sick person with a loaf of bread and then feeding the bread to a dog or passing a child through the split trunk of a tree to cure rickets. These practices may seem bizarre to us, but to medieval minds, they made sense within a worldview where illness was connected to both natural and supernatural forces. The Church maintained a complicated relationship with magical cures. Officially, it condemned sorcery and superstition as dangerous and heretical. Yet many magical practices incorporated Christian prayers, relics, or rituals, making them difficult to distinguish from approved religious practices. A charm invoking the Lord's Prayer could be tolerated, while one invoking obscure spirits might be condemned. Priests themselves sometimes engaged in magical healing, blessing water, making the sign of the cross over patients, or prescribing pilgrimages to holy sites. The boundaries were fluid, and patients often saw little distinction between sacred and magical remedies. For them, the goal was simply to be healed, and the means mattered less than the result. Doctors and learned physicians also had to navigate this landscape carefully. Some dismissed magical cures as foolish, while others incorporated them into their practice. A physician might prescribe herbs alongside a charm, hedging his bets to satisfy both science and superstition. Others distanced themselves, insisting that their authority came from texts and theory, not spells. Yet even the most skeptical could not ignore the expectations of patients, who often demanded charms or talismans as part of their treatment. To refuse might mean losing trust or business. To accept meant compromising with practices that blurred the line between medicine and magic. For patients, magical cures offered something that formal medicine often could not: agency. A charm or talisman could be carried at all times, a tangible reminder of protection. A spell could be repeated by family members, giving them a role in the healing process. These practices gave people a sense of control over illness, a way to fight back when doctors and remedies failed. Even if the cure was ineffective, the psychological comfort was real. In a world of uncertainty, magic provided meaning and hope, and that alone could sometimes make a difference in how illness was endured. Imagine yourself as a medieval doctor, confronted with a patient suffering from recurring fevers. You prescribe bloodletting and a cooling diet, but the family insists on a charm against evil spirits. They show you a parchment with a prayer written on it, asking you to bless it before it is tied around the patient's neck. Do you refuse, citing your learning, or do you comply, knowing that their faith in the charm may bring comfort? In another case, a patient with toothache demands a magical cure involving frog bones. You know it will not help, but you also know that rejecting it outright may erode their trust. To practice medicine in this world was to balance science, faith, and superstition, often all in the same consultation. The persistence of magical cures also reflects the inadequacy of medieval medicine. When remedies failed and patients continued to suffer, people sought alternatives. Magic filled that vacuum, offering possibilities where none seemed to exist. It was a reminder that healing is as much about belief as about biology, and that in times of desperation, people will turn to any source of hope. The medieval world, with its fragile knowledge and limited cures, was fertile ground for such practices. Doctors, priests, and folk healers all participated in this mixture, creating a medical culture that was as much mystical as it was practical. For a modern person imagining themselves as a medieval doctor, engaging with magical cures would be frustrating and alien. You would know that frog bones and buried bacon cannot cure disease, yet you would face patients who demanded them. You would feel torn between your own skepticism and their expectations, between reason and tradition. To last even a single day would require patience and adaptability, an ability to meet people where they were, even if their beliefs conflicted with your own. The challenge was not only medical, but cultural, for healing was inseparable from the worldview of the society you served. The legacy of magical cures is curious. Many of the specific practices have vanished, but the impulse behind them remains. Even today, people turn to alternative medicines, charms, and rituals when conventional treatments fail. The desire for control, meaning, and hope persists across centuries. Medieval magic reminds us that medicine is never just about the body. It is also about the mind, the spirit, and the search for comfort in the face of suffering. As we move into our final chapter, we will step back from the details of herbs, surgeries, and charms, and reflect on what it truly meant to be a medieval doctor. In the next chapter, we will consider the burdens, the limits, and the resilience of those who practiced medicine in this world, and why most of us would not last even a single day in their place. To walk in the shoes of a medieval doctor was to step into a world defined by uncertainty, suffering, and a constant shadow of death. Unlike modern physicians, armed with microscopes, vaccines, and antibiotics, the medieval healer faced illness with only fragments of knowledge and a framework built on humors, astrology, faith, and superstition. Their burden was immense. Patients expected them to cure the incurable. Society held them responsible for failures, and their own consciences were haunted by the countless lives lost under their care. To imagine lasting even a single day in their place is to realize how fragile and difficult their role truly was. The weight of expectation was enormous. For the wealthy, hiring a physician was a mark of status as much as a hope for healing. A lord or lady who summoned the doctor expected not only treatment, but reassurance, wisdom, and dignity. The physician's words carried the authority of ancient texts, the solemnity of university training, and the aura of learned tradition. Yet behind that authority often lay doubt. A prescription of bloodletting, a diet of cooling herbs, or a carefully timed procedure might offer little real relief. The doctor knew, deep down, that his tools were limited. Still, he was expected to embody confidence, to speak with certainty, even when he felt none. For the poor, who could not afford physicians, barber-surgeons, apothecaries, midwives, and folk healers filled the gap. These practitioners bore a different burden. Their patients were neighbors, family, and fellow villagers. When a treatment failed, it was not an abstract failure, but a personal tragedy that reverberated through the community. The healer's reputation lived or died with their outcomes. To be accused of incompetence was damaging. To be accused of witchcraft or malice was fatal. Women in particular bore this risk, their healing roles intertwined with suspicion and fear. The burden was not only medical but social, a constant negotiation of trust and doubt. The medieval doctor's burden was compounded by the ever-present specter of epidemics. The Black Death, leprosy, smallpox, and countless fevers swept through towns and villages, overwhelming the ability of any healer to respond. In times of plague, doctors themselves became symbols of both hope and futility. The plague doctor's beaked mask and heavy robes were meant to protect, but in truth they offered little defense. To treat plague victims was to walk willingly toward one's own likely death. Many doctors fled. Others stayed and perished. The decision itself was a burden, torn between self-preservation and duty. To face an epidemic without understanding or cure was perhaps the heaviest weight a medieval healer carried. The physical demands of the role were also crushing. Surgeons performed amputations, trepanning, and bladder stone removals without anesthesia, enduring the screams and convulsions of their patients. Apothecaries prepared complex remedies, grinding, oiling, and mixing strange ingredients day after day. Monks in infirmaries tended to the sick through long nights, balancing prayer with care. All of them faced exhaustion, poor conditions, and the constant threat of infection. Without knowledge of antiseptics or hygiene, healers often fell ill themselves. To survive as a doctor was not only to endure others' pain, but to risk one's own life continually. The intellectual burden was no less heavy. Doctors were bound by tradition, taught to revere the words of Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna as near infallible. To question these authorities was dangerous, even heretical. Yet observation sometimes clashed with theory. A doctor might see that a treatment failed repeatedly, but feel compelled to prescribe it again, because the texts demanded it. The conflict between experience and tradition created inner turmoil. Some, like Al-Razi, or later Vesalius, dared to challenge accepted wisdom, but most did not. To be a medieval doctor was to carry the burden of knowledge that was often wrong, yet held sacred. And then there was the spiritual burden. Illness was not seen as purely physical, but as a reflection of sin, divine will, or cosmic imbalance. Doctors had to navigate the expectations of clergy, patients, and families who demanded spiritual as well as physical remedies. They were expected to recommend prayer, confession, and pilgrimages alongside herbs and bloodletting. Failure to acknowledge the spiritual dimension could invite suspicion of impiety or even sorcery. The doctor was thus a mediator, not only of bodies but of souls, his role straddling the line between healer and spiritual guide. For some, this was a source of strength. For others, it was an inescapable weight. Imagine yourself in their place. A patient lies before you, feverish and pale, their family pleading for help. You prescribe bleeding, diet, and prayer, but days later, the patient dies. The family looks at you with grief, perhaps even anger. You move to your next case, but the memory lingers. Another patient suffers from a festering wound. You amputate swiftly, only for infection to claim them within the week. At night, you wonder whether your actions saved or doomed them. Yet you must rise the next day and do it all again, because there is no one else. To last a day in this role would be exhausting. To last a lifetime would demand resilience bordering on the unimaginable. Despite these burdens, medieval doctors persevered. They were motivated by duty, curiosity, faith, and sometimes ambition. They sought to ease suffering, even when their tools were inadequate. They preserved knowledge, however flawed, that would eventually lead to progress. They bore the scorn of failures and the fleeting gratitude of successes. Their legacy is not in their cures, few of which would pass muster today, but in their persistence. They remind us that medicine is a human endeavor, always evolving, always limited, yet always striving toward healing. For a modern person, the conclusion is clear. Most of us would not last even a single day as a medieval doctor. The uncertainty, the futility, the constant presence of death, and the weight of expectation would crush us. Yet their endurance, however flawed, laid the groundwork for the medicine we now take for granted. To walk in their shoes is to understand not only their burdens, but their courage, and to appreciate the long, painful path that brought us to the knowledge we possess today. As we leave behind the world of medieval doctors, we arrive at our closing reflections. In the final section, we will draw together the threads of this journey, considering what these strange practices and heavy burdens reveal about human resilience, and why the story of medieval medicine continues to fascinate us today. We have reached the end of our journey into the strange, fascinating, and often unsettling world of medieval medicine. Along the way, we have walked through bustling apothecary shops, filled with jars of exotic herbs and powders, wandered the cloisters of monasteries, where monks tended the sick with prayer and plants, and shuddered at the horrors of surgery performed without anesthesia. We have stood beside plague doctors in their eerie beaked masks, faced the chaos of battlefield tents overflowing with the wounded, and listened to the whispered charms of midwives and folk healers. At every step, we have seen how fragile life was in the Middle Ages, and how those entrusted with healing carried burdens heavier than most of us can imagine today. If there is one truth that emerges from this journey, it is that medicine in the Middle Ages was not simply a matter of science. It was a tapestry woven from faith, tradition, superstition, and fragments of practical knowledge. Doctors relied on humors, astrology, and ancient texts, even when those ideas failed to match reality. Patients turned to relics, charms, and magical cures, not because they were ignorant, but because they were desperate for hope. Healing was as much about belief as it was about the body, and doctors were caught in the middle, expected to satisfy both the practical and the spiritual needs of those who sought their help. For us, living in a world of antibiotics, vaccines, and advanced technology, it can be easy to scoff at medieval practices. Bloodletting, urine tasting, frog bone charms, these seem absurd, even laughable. But to dismiss them outright is to misunderstand the context in which they thrived. Medieval doctors did not have the tools we possess. They could not see germs under a microscope or understand the circulation of blood. They built their medicine on what they had: observation, tradition, and the writings of ancient authorities. In their own way, they were doing the best they could with the knowledge available. Their failures were tragic, but their persistence was remarkable. It is also worth remembering that not everything from medieval medicine was misguided. Herbal remedies like willow bark for pain, garlic for infection, and honey for wounds had real benefits that modern science later confirmed. The hospitals founded in this era, though focused on charity and spiritual care, laid the foundation for the institutions we rely on today. The translations of Arabic texts preserved and expanded ancient knowledge, ensuring that the wisdom of Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna reached future generations. Even the flawed system of humors provided a framework that encouraged observation and pattern-seeking, qualities essential to scientific progress. In this sense, medieval medicine was not a dead end, but a stepping stone, part of the long, uneven path to modern medicine. Still, it is clear that most of us would not survive as medieval doctors or as their patients. The constant uncertainty, the lack of effective treatments, the weight of death pressing in on every side, these would overwhelm us. To face plague without understanding, to cut into flesh without anesthesia, to prescribe remedies knowing they often failed such burdens, demanded resilience few of us possess. Yet the very fact that doctors, surgeons, midwives, and healers persevered speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. They may not have had answers, but they had the courage to keep trying. As we reflect on their world, we also gain perspective on our own. We live in a time when medicine can accomplish wonders that would have seemed like miracles to medieval people, curing infections, repairing organs, even replacing hearts and lungs. And yet, we too face uncertainties, new diseases, and limits to what we can cure. The story of medieval doctors reminds us that medicine has always been a struggle against the unknown, a balance between knowledge and hope. It reminds us to appreciate the progress we have made and to remain humble about the challenges that remain. For those of you listening tonight, perhaps lying in bed and letting these stories carry you toward sleep, I hope this journey has been both soothing and thought-provoking. History, even when filled with suffering and strangeness, can be a gentle companion. It reminds us that people in the past faced struggles as daunting as our own, and that their efforts, however flawed, contributed to the world we inhabit today. If nothing else, the story of medieval doctors may help us feel a little more grateful for the world we live in now, where pain can be eased, diseases treated, and hope grounded in knowledge rather than superstition. Before we close, I want to thank you for joining me on this long journey. If you've enjoyed this exploration of history designed to help you rest, please remember to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss future stories of strange, fascinating, and sometimes comforting moments from the past. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What topics from history interest you most? Do you listen to these stories as you fall asleep at night, or during the day when you need calm? Your thoughts help shape the stories we tell, and your presence helps this community grow. So as you drift off to sleep, imagine the flicker of candlelight in a medieval hospital, the rustle of pages in a scholar's manuscript, the clink of bottles in an apothecary's shop. Imagine the voices of doctors and healers, burdened with uncertainty, yet striving to help. Their world was strange, often frightening, but it was also deeply human. And in their struggles, we see a reflection of our own, a reminder that the search for healing, the desire to ease suffering, and the hope for a better tomorrow are timeless. Thank you for listening, for sharing this journey through the strange world of medieval doctors, and for allowing history to accompany you into rest. May the stories of the past bring you comfort, perspective, and peace, tonight and always.